Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is part 1 of our story. If you like this what if story and want to see part 2, let me know in the comments below. Before we start, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. Also, check the description for more great content and my playlist. This story was posted by 𝗵𝗃 on Wattpad. Now let's start. The man's green locks flew through the wind elegantly as he looked at the busy marketplace. He turned to the voice behind him that called out his name. Izuku. He ran towards the woman with the darker green hair. Yes, Mom. Can you get us some more bread for this evening? The woman asked as she pushed some silver coins in the short boy's hand. Izuku smiled brightly and nodded. He loved going to the center of the village, 'cause he was often not allowed due to his mom's scared nature. 11 He ran down the hill where their cottage was located and quickly started greeting the smiling bystanders as he took a left onto the big street. The smell of warm food entered his nose. A part of him wanted to use all the coins on hot pastries all of a sudden, but he quickly shook his head and looked around for the bread stand. He walked past the bright oranges hanging from the wooden boxes and hugged a passing boy, who clinged onto his knee. Oh, 𝗧𝗵𝗲. He called out to the boy still grabbing at his pants. Have you manifested your gender yet? The greenette crouched next to the boy to reach eye level with the other. Your mom told me you're almost at the age. No, 𝗧𝗵𝗲 answered in his usual monotone angry voice. But I don't care, I'll totally manifest as an alpha, he brought out in a cocky tone. That's what the physician said. Izuku just laughed at the little boy's determination. 9 Well, I'm sure you'll make a strong alpha, the green-haired boy promised and stood back up to reach the bread stand. Tell your mom I said hi, he told the boy with a rub over his head. And tell her I'll come back down later for water. The little boy waved and nodded at the passing taller figure. His parents work down by the river to preserve water for the whole village. The people that live there all don't have much, but they help others in need. It's a peaceful life in the small town. Izuku walked past some more streets of people smiling at him to get him to buy something. He still clearly remembers the day he manifested as a beta. His mom had been so glad and so was he. Omegas and alphas are treated equal in the village, but it's a harder life. 9 omegas are stuck with a monthly heat that is unable to be suppressed. They sway at an alpha's whims because of their pheromones and are more prone to being weak. In the village they might believe in equality, but there are just differences that no one can ignore. After a few years, alphas started noticing an omega smell on the green-haired boy and started asking questions. The local physician declared Izuku a recessive omega. An omega that shows late and doesn't have much of a smell, no real heats, but has the ability to smell alphas like a real one. Izuku hasn't really thought much about it. He's never smelled anyone's pheromones, so for all he knows people are lying about the scent he apparently produces. It doesn't matter in this village anyway. So he never really bothered worrying about his gender much. The empires are a total different story. They're still great believers of the alpha, beta, and omega hierarchy and the legends surrounding fated pairs. Izuku was just lucky enough to not have been born there. A light brown round bread for your sweet mother. The vendor tried to get Izuku to buy something, which made Izuku wake up from his thoughts. He smiled brightly, finally being able to answer one of the vendor's offers with coins. Yes, that's exactly it, ma'am, Izuku answered with a grateful voice, as the woman started packing the most delicious bread. She had a talent for creating the most tasteful things out of the whole village. She put her dark black hair behind her ear. Just call me Momo, she chuckles as it seemed something she has to have been repeating multiple times. Izuku just bows to apologize and thanked her for the bread, as he handed her all of the coins. 2 Well, thank you, Momo, the greenette brought out in a hesitating voice. I'm sure my mom will enjoy it. He reassured the woman behind the wooden stand. You've got a special talent. A compliment flew the woman's way, making her blush a bit. Oh please, don't flatter me, she turned the compliment down as she moved her hand in a playful way, as if she was fanning the words away. I'm sure you excel in better things than me. They both laughed in a polite way as Izuku waved before taking his leave. He's never really thought about it too much. Maybe because he's too afraid of confronting it. Everybody seems to have this talent and this role in the village, but he however doesn't seem to fit in the puzzle. He tends to blame it on his mother, who doesn't allow him outside much every time these annoying thoughts seem to surface, but deep down he knows she's not the one to blame. At this age his talent and future should have become more clear, right? 6. Izuku shook his green wavy curls to get the ideas out of his head. Suddenly the bread tumbled out of his hands as someone bumped into him at a high speed. His smaller body fell towards the harsh ground as he saw the man that bumped into him laying across the street. "Are you okay, sir?" Izuku brought out as he reached his pale hands out to the man, who seemed to have been in quite the hurry. The greenette saw the man was shaking. "What happened?" he asked with a worried expression. But before Izuku can finish his last word, the man had already gotten up and started running at the same hasty speed. He started yelling throughout the crowd in an obvious panic, "They're coming! They're coming! Get away! Hide! They're coming!" Izuku now got up himself and tried to rub the dirty stains off of his knees. He looked up as he heard screaming from afar. The whole marketplace attention got grabbed at the end of the street where the loud sounds were coming from. What's happening? Izuku could only see hazy shadows that seemed to become bigger. Soon enough the brown splotches seemed to become horses with men in silver and golden harnesses attached to them. The screams were coming from the lower shadows, that all seemed to be people from the village. They were running towards the main street fearing for their lives. Izuku quickly turned around and started running deeper into the village, even though he realized there's no way the horses wouldn't catch up with him in no time. What's happening? The question roamed the greenette's head again. Don't tell me, he thought to himself. Are those knights from the Empire? Izuku ran past the wooden stalls deeper into the village. His only chance to get away from all of this was with a place of hiding, so he quickly tried to rush into an abandoned store. The man held onto one of the wooden tables against the wall, as he quickly hid himself underneath. He heard more screaming and crying that was coming from the outside. What were they possibly doing to these people? He heard the sound of loud metal crushing against each other, now stopping in front of the store. It seemed like he'll soon know the answer to his question. The greenette held his breath with a hand over his mouth, as if his life depended on it. He could hear the knight yelling to another one. I saw one disappear in here. Izuku's hands started trembling, realizing that they were talking about him. He could only feel his heart beating inside his head, as he kept refraining from taking even a single breath. The knight seemed to come closer and eventually halted right in front of the table where Izuku was hiding. The dumbass is over here, was yelled, before a big arm reached for the smaller boy roughly. Izuku was pulled from under the table in a second, as he now hung in the other's grip that was tightly on his clothes. The man's eyes lit up, as his nose seemed to twitch. 6. Yes, this is a good one. The knight yelled and cut a deep wound on the greenette's side. Ow wow, Izuku screamed out, as blood started pouring out of the cut. Before he could fight back, he got dragged out of the store by force. 6. Izuku whined out, asking for answers. What had he meant by, good one? The knight finally let go of his waist as he threw him in a big group of people. What's going on? The greenette asked the woman next to him. She trembled in fear while shaking her head, signaling she had no idea, while Izuku suddenly noticed the same deep cut on the other's body. The greenette realized the knights were selecting people and marking them when they meet a certain criteria. What could it be? What did he have in common with all of these people? He looked around and noticed not a single common physical trait. He quickly concluded it wasn't a physical trait they were selecting, it was genders. What secondary gender are you? He asked the people next to him in the crowd. They all answered they were betas. Izuku's face lost all color. They selected him wrong, because he's a recessive. His fingers twitched as he pushed himself along the betas, all pushed together by numerous guards with swords. He started yelling at one of them when he reached the edge of the circle. I'm not a beta. The man just ignored him and swung his sword almost across Izuku's face. I'm an omega, please. But before the man could answer, the crowd pulled him across the field. They all got forced into these cages to make it to their destination without any runaways. The greenette got forced in a small cage pressed together with 20 other betas to start their journey. He kept yelling at the knights on the horses, as they elegantly passed beside him to lead the cages in the right direction. I'm an omega. I shouldn't be here. Eventually Izuku's voice got tired, and he was met with the crying of everyone else. His fingers dug into the metal of the edge of the cage, as he already saw the great empire they were being trafficked to. It was that of the most feared emperor in history. There couldn't follow much good. Izuku followed the line of betas into the big ballroom. They were all earlier forced into the same formal servant attire. All the men in servant tuxedos and women in maids' dresses. Now they were all led into parallel lines by the knight's swords. The nervous 𝗲𝗄𝗃 tripled closely behind the people in front of them and mimicked their movements. When all of them faced in front of them, he quickly cocked his head to the side too. This was so nerve-wracking. What were they planning with this many people? All of a sudden he noticed a big throne with a tall, muscled blonde seated in it. He seemed to look at the hundreds of people in distaste. Izuku remembered him now, as his eyes widened in fear. His name was Katsuki Bakugu. He is the most feared and ruthless emperor known around the countries. The 𝗲𝗄𝗃 has heard awful things about this person. The rumors describe him as a merciless ruler, taking people's heads for just addressing him wrongly. The shivers in his hands and knees just became worse, as Izuku realized the emperor only gets served by betas because of their inability to smell alpha nor omega's pheromones, nor do they get heats. But how is he possibly supposed to tell the knights that he's an omega? His feet thought about moving forward, when suddenly he heard a girl crying and running towards the outside. "Let me go!" She screamed out, and her pink body immediately gets snatched by the guards and dragged in front of the emperor. 9 tears streamed down her pink-colored face, as the guards still pushed their rough hands into her same-colored hair to keep her on the ground. "I want to go home, sire." The blonde watched the dark crying eyes with an indifferent expression. "Take her to the dungeon," he spoke in an uninterested tone, as everybody in the room knew what those words had meant. He moved his hand to the side, as if waving the thought of the crying girl off. For Izuku quickly put his feet back in line, knowing convincing or talking to the knights or emperor was possible. The best he could do now is stay unnoticed, so no eyes go on him. The angry blonde shifted on his seat and watched all people with the same wound in their side. His eyes squinted at the slightest detail, as if he tried to spot certain characteristics. The 𝗲𝗄𝗃 was pretty sure the emperor was selecting something again. This time not based on secondary genders, but clearly looking for something else. Every single one of you will serve me." The feared emperor filled the eerie silence, some in the kitchen, some the gardens, bedrooms, fields, and some cleaned the 30-feet tower windows. He explained why he brought all of them here. Everybody in the ballroom became silent and looked down at their feet. Not a single person wanted to do any of the things he'd listed. "And only one of you, since none of my old staff could do it." Suddenly all the other tasks became much more desired, as the emperor said the following 8 words. "Plus, will be my one and only personal servant." The silence in the ballroom grew thicker. All of the betas now wished to be assigned to the other tasks, since serving the emperor wasn't only terrifying, but also asking to get thrown into the dungeon by midnight. The tall, strong emperor stood up from his throne, leaving everyone to swallow a breath. He stepped confident between the lines and looked down on his underlings, as if he was trying to confirm their position under him. His tall stature walked past the first few lines and then halted at his first person. It was a tall, appealing young lady. He asked her a deafening monotone question: "What side of the village?" He doesn't even take the time to ask a full question. The woman answers him with a fearing voice: "South, my lord," and Katsuki scoffed, as if he was approving. He walked further on to his next target and stopped in front of a next person after he skipped over 10 of them. "You," he said with an angry voice at the woman in front of him, "what side of the village?" The woman fidgeted with her fingers, unable to look the tall, intimidating man in front of her in the eyes. "By the water, your majesty." That answer got the emperor's eyes twitching in anger. He immediately skipped over her and kept walking, as he brought out his annoyance. "This dumb one doesn't even know how to give directions." Katsuki kept doing this with many of the lines, as if he was going to go over all hundreds of the people. Nobody ever got more than 3 questions, and the emperor soon seemed to lose interest in every single one of them. More and more relieved faces filled the ballroom every time he stepped by one of the betas. It was clear he was selecting his personal maid, so you did not want his expensive shoes to halt by your place in the line. Izuku saw the angry blonde inching closer and closer when he finally reached the greenette. The boy kept his eyes on the ground immediately, so the tall emperor would quickly just look over him. He heard the footsteps to his left nearing, when he closed his eyes due to stress. When he opened them, he'd hoped to see the feet already past his place in line, but when he did, the expensive shoes were right in front of him. One was the emperor still walking. His question got quickly answered when he got asked his first question, "What side of the village are you from?" Izuku's breath got caught in his throat, as he felt unable to breathe. His voice can't be trusted as it trembled in his answer. 𝗵𝘃𝗲 from the no northern high hill. Sire, Izuku stuttered out after many tries, which immediately got an annoyed reaction from the alpha in front of him. This question was probably in his favor, since it's pretty abandoned. The emperor was obviously looking for betas from higher-ranking families within the village. Izuku didn't have any wealth to speak of and didn't even have a job, so the chances he would meet the cold blonde's requirements were very slim. What family? Was the next question the greenette received. Izuku fidgeted with his fingers and still stared at the ground. He hadn't even looked the emperor in the eyes for 1 second. He was too terrified to face the man. 𝗵𝘃𝗲, sire, Izuku answered, knowing this also won't mean much, since his family isn't even known around the village, let alone around the nobles. As the greenette had suspected, the others still wore this confused but mostly annoyed expression. I've never seen such green hair. 5. The whole room grows deadly silent immediately, since this was the first time there didn't follow a question from the emperor. To everyone's surprise, it was a normal sentence that didn't require a boring short answer. Izuku felt his heart beating in his head. What was he supposed to do? This didn't mean any good. He was definitely being noticed, so this could mean only two things. Or he was in the running for the job as personal servant, or he would soon be disposed of in the Dongyun. Both options were absolutely horrible. 7. He could hear the guards behind him whispering to one another. It only made his fear stronger that his predictions were right. He kept his eyes on the floor and bit his lower lip, fighting to the long, eerie silence. Suddenly, he felt a touch on the top of his head, as if something was pressing down on his green locks. Izuku didn't dare to look up, but he seemed to come to the weirdest conclusion. Was the emperor smelling him? The greenette looked up without thinking and pushes the emperor away, as his face displays quite the panic. Izuku's eyes now finally see the emperor from close up, and his eyes widen. He couldn't deny that the tall, muscular man in front of him was appealing. He had never seen anyone like this. He had a sharp face and vibrant crimson eyes. His irises contained wild fires, just like the explosive look of his ashy blonde hair. Izuku eventually realized he was staring after a full 10 seconds and quickly closed his bewildered mouth. He apologized softly and looked back down, "So sorcery," only to realize that his feet weren't on the line anymore. It seemed he only now grasped the fact he had shoved the emperor with his own bare hands and stepped out of the line. His heart stopped as he tried to swallow his nerves, unable to look at the still silent man in front of him. The room filled with silent whispers at the obvious crime the greenette had just committed. Izuku could see the man's arm in front of him lifting towards the guards. He was sure he would soon be carried off. The green-haired boy waited for the man's cold command, knowing it would mean his death. The room finally filled with the words everyone was waiting for, but not quite what Izuku had expected. "Plus, I've decided. He'll be my personal servant." Izuku followed the tall man that was leading him through the hallways in silence. He had a white beard and long pigmentless locks. The emperor's personal servant has a separate sleeping quarters from the others. He spoke coldly, like his ice blue eyes. 3. He had dark circles under his eyes and a scary tone in his voice. "That's because you should be able to reach him briefly, and none of the others are allowed in his wing." He continued to explain their long journey through the palace. Izuku still couldn't believe the mess he had worked himself in. What was he going to do? He had hoped to not be noticed and later be able to escape, but it seemed the opposite had happened. "How many per personal servants has sire had?" Izuku hesitantly asked. The man halted and turned his gaze to the shorter boy with an angry glare. It was as if he was debating whether or not to answer such an impolite interruption. Izuku quickly slipped his eyes towards the floor to apologize. Hundreds, the man smirked, eventually answering, since the information wouldn't be any good news to the new servant anyway. None of them lasted for more than a week. Izuku's eyes widened in fear as the other had already started walking. It was even worse than he had initially thought. He quickly tried to pick up his pace to reach the older servant again. Danjuro then stopped swiftly, almost making the 𝗧𝗓𝗏 bump into him. "We're here," he announced and brought his hand up to the open door. Izuku walked into the small room. It had a singular bed and lots of shelving full of books. He noticed a desk in the corner of the room, and it didn't even have a window. He could already feel how alone this would be. "Sire has already asked for you to attend to his supper," Danjuro announced to the still processing 𝗧𝗓𝗏. "So follow this way, 12th door to the right with golden suns to reach the Majesty's dining hall." The man seemed to already take his steps back to where they came from, but halted. "And if you don't want to get killed," Danjuro brought out, still facing the outside, but obviously feeling a bit of pity now, "don't touch him, don't talk, and don't look him in the eyes." As soon as the man left, Izuku closed the door and checked for any escape routes. But since he didn't even have a window, he came up empty. The closets were bolted shut, and even the books seemed to be fake and glued to the shelves. Why would someone even do that? He then reached a big book that seemed to be able to move off of the shelves. It had weird signs on it. It was just like any other book, since Izuku couldn't read much, but the symbols didn't seem like any of the other letters. When he couldn't find a single use for those heavy pages either, he seemed to have given up. He sighed and slid against the door onto the cold floor. His chin rested on his knees as he felt tears welling up in his eyes. He quickly wiped them away and tried to stay strong, since tear marks might not meet the Emperor's taste. All he could do right now is try to obey any of the Emperor's wishes. That is, if he wished to stay alive. So Izuku eventually got back up and straightened out his tuxedo. He took a deep breath for the lost courage and then left the small room to follow the older servant's instructions. He quickly reached the 12th door on the right and noticed the expensive golden plates on the door. They represented shining suns and their warmth, with every curve and diamond installed in the luxurious piece. Izuku almost choked on the thick air, realizing the worth of these. He had never even seen real gold in the village. Why would the Emperor use so much gold just for his dining hall door? It could only mean he had it in abundance. If he was so wealthy, how could he then still steal people from the village? "He seems like a selfish, greedy man," Izuku mumbles under his breath. The shorter green-haired boy shook his head and clicked his tongue, wearing quite a disappointed, angry expression. When suddenly a low voice echoed behind him. "Do you not like my golden piece?" "Eek." Izuku squealed out in surprise and immediately turned to look up at the voice. Dropped when he saw it was the Emperor. His eyes widened, realizing they were meeting the deep crimson ones in front of him. Izuku immediately pointed his gaze down, correcting himself, while wishing it wasn't too late. "That old fart seemed to have given you the memo," the warm voice continued, as the hot breath reached the 𝗧𝗓𝗏's curls. "But I did ask you, peasant 𝗵𝘃𝗏 something, so who are you to ignore me?" The Emperor changed into a dangerous tone, while furrowing his brows deeply. Izuku's hands trembled as he looked at them in defeat. I do like it. A lot even," the shorter boy mumbled and stuttered out, still facing towards the marble white floors. He flinched as the other scoffed in his face and then filled the halls with laughter. "Wow, you were doing me a favor not opening that lowly mouth of yours," he spoke as he still recovered from laughing. "You can't even speak properly." Izuku bit his lip as he hid his now heated cheeks. This was all so embarrassing and rude. For the tall blonde man walked past the 𝗧𝗓𝗏 and pushed the door. He then turned around facing the smaller boy and continued, but even more than that, as a darker tone followed with his first warning. "Plus, I hate liars." Izuku hesitantly followed the tall man inside. The room had even more golden-plated wall art, even paintings of previous leaders. Izuku couldn't help but look at the luxurious art with widened eyes. It seemed as if he had already forgotten the other's previous words. 19 Katsuki walked up to a long dark wooden table that seemed as if it could fit 40 people and then halted as he reached the tallest seat with red diamonds emplated. It was obvious that was where the Emperor would eat, of course at the head of the table. Izuku suddenly felt the man's gaze slip onto him, as he quickly looked away from the paintings. Had he made a mistake again? Had he insulted the emperor again? He looked down at his feet as he trembled, hearing the other stepping closer. "2, you look like a scared rabbit," the emperor spoke as he covered his mouth, hiding a soft cuckle with one of his gloved hands. "I don't blame you," Katsuki smirked with an evil expression, almost starting to enjoy the nervousness of the other. "I work with strict rules, strict deadlines, strict mannerisms, and no second chances," the cold-blooded emperor continued, looking closely at the other who still had his eyes glued on the floor. 5, agreed. Katsuki asked in a bit nicer tone now, as he leaned towards the other, while still resting next to the table. Izuku kept his mouth shut, unknowing of what to do. "They told him not to talk, right? So you're ignoring me again." 6, Katsuki now towered over the shorter boy and seemed to sniff the top of his head again. "You peasants never learn, do you?" The emperor took quite a bit of distance again, as if he didn't want to touch the gnat. No. Izuku quickly stuttered out as the emperor seemed at a safe distance, before quickly forcing his eyes back on his feet. "I was under the impression I wasn't allowed to ta-dash. Shut it," for sounds a cold command from the other side of the room, followed by the crunch of a metal blade being pulled from its sleeve. Izuku's eyes widened at the sharp shimmering edge of the sword now pointing right at his mouth. "The only words allowed to come out of that pretty little mouth of yours are, 'Yes,'" he orders with a devilish smirk the other can't see. "You heard me," he added with a curious glint in his eyes to what the boy in front of him would answer. 5, Izuku stuttered out, almost flinching at any coming attacks from the golden blade still in front of him. To his surprise, the blade didn't move, but the blonde tall emperor didn't retrieve it either. 1, good, Katsuki smirked out in satisfaction to the other's earned obedience, "'cause it wouldn't be the first time I'd have to cut open the sides of one of my servants' mouths," he added as he visibly saw a shiver going down the gnat's spine. 3, "I'd have to get my guards pull your hair back, so I can cut nicely around the skin." The blonde now moved the sword alongst the other's lips, almost grazing against the pale skin. "One to the right and another on the left, so I have a nice range to cut out the things needed." 2, Izuku felt his eyes tearing as they followed the sword, almost piercing his face. The emperor was insane. What was he planning to cut out? Did he really do this to other servants? In less than a week, the chances of survival were becoming less promising by the second. "And I wouldn't quite enjoy that," the emperor now spoke as he finally got the blade further from the short boy's face. "Since that would stain my appealing golden blade with such filthy beauty." For Izuku feels the man stepping back with repulsion. The emperor really meant every word he was saying, since he hadn't even dared to touch the gnat in front of him. The blonde really believed he was too dirty to die by his hands. The gnat felt a tear trickle down his cheek, as if tickling his freckles before landing on the cold floor. The emperor seemed unfazed. Since Izuku probably wasn't the first personal servant to react like this, he just continued. "But don't worry," Katsuki reassured, "I won't ask you lots of questions," as he now moved closer towards the head of the table and sat down into his golden-plated chair, unbothered by the other's sniffling. "I hate that high-pitched stuttering voice of yours anyway," the emperor added as if that made anything better. Before Izuku could process the insult, the blonde continued, not being nearly done with his list of wishes. "Things are simple," he spoke nonchalantly as he looked at his golden blade with interest. "No talking or I'll cut out your tongue," the first rule echoed through the tall dining room, also answering Izuku's earlier question. "No touching or I'll remove your limbs," he added another one, as he swung his golden metal into small circles, as if he was bored. "And no looking in the eyes, or I'll carve out those big jaden beads of yours." 3, he emperor halted with a pensive expression, as if checking he hadn't missed any of his usual speech. "Those are the most important rules," he then continued more confidently. "Other ones are simple, like kneeling and bowing in every occasion." He spoke before waiting for a moment and then sliding his golden sword against the ground next to his seat. Like now, he smirked out as the gnat obviously flinched and quickly followed his command. "And most importantly, obeying my every command," after the other had answered with yes as the gnat got on his thin knees on the floor right next to his seat. Katsuki glinted. He enjoyed the absolute espin and the boy seemed so easy to give, He almost wanted to toy some more. One, it was always the same, so within a week the person in front of him would die in the dungeon. There was never anything to feel anything about, just boring. He had always hoped someone would be different, and today he had a tad feeling that this small, nervous, green-haired boy might be. Plus, interesting. Izuku rushed out of his bed and hurried in his tuxedo. The sun was up, which meant he'd have to wake and bathe the emperor. It had been 2 days since this routine had started now, and Izuku could only seem to count in his head how little time he had left. 3. Every servant, and even the emperor himself, made it obvious not a single personal servant lived longer than a week after being chosen. For some reason that made the green-haired boy determined to prove that wrong. He quickly splashed his face with water to get himself awake, since the emperor did not let him sleep at all. He always had new commands up his sleeve, making the shorter boy run everywhere till exhaustion. His wet curls, due to the splashing, left little drops on the marble floors as he ran up to the emperor's wing. Only Izuku was allowed in that wing. Not a single other servant set foot in the angry blonde's room. Although the greenette wasn't sure whether that was because of set rules or by the mere fact they were too scared to do so. For Izuku lifted his pale hand up to the tall door of the emperor's bedroom. His knuckles tapped towards the door slightly as it almost immediately opened. The boy kept his eyes on the ground in fear, watching the emperor's shoes. The angry blonde never really seemed to get good sleep, since he was waiting at the door every morning. He always was already clothed and bathed, but seemed exhausted even after sleeping. The greenette bit his lip as he swallowed the words, "Good morning," remembering he wasn't allowed to say anything. He waited for the emperor to word a demand. Suddenly one of the emperor's fingers pushed on the smaller boy's lip. "Stop biting your lip to the point it bleeds," Katsuki spoke, making Izuku consider the cold man cared. "The BLD is displeasing," he conveyed with a disappointing expression. "You always do it when you so clearly want to open your lowly mouth," he now brought out with a smirk as he let go of the other's face. He still couldn't quite see the jade eyes hidden under the darker green curls. "Do you think your words are important?" After a short silence, Katsuki laughed, realizing the other was still under the impression he couldn't talk. "Whatever you just thought of," the blonde started as he now walked to his wide balcony from his room. "Say," Izuku's eyes widened as he took a glimpse at the other now walking away from him. It doesn't seem like you sleep much." The green-haired boy stuttered out. But the Omega couldn't go on much further. The blonde man had already taken away his voice and right to speak by solely answering. "You think you have worry to spare for others." The emperor laughed in the distance, still watching the outside with his tired eyes. "It seems I don't keep you busy enough." Katsuki quickly turned around with a devilish smile. Izuku quickly focused his gaze back onto the emperor's feet, hoping the split second of eye contact would go unnoticed. His eyes widened to the emperor's words. What did he mean, not busy enough? The greenette had been running everywhere at day and night for the past 2 days. He couldn't take any more work. He was sure of it. He shouldn't have said anything. His words from earlier might have cost his life. The smaller boy almost drew BLD again as he bit his lip in frustration. Was this the emperor's way of keeping his maids in check? This was the only time Izuku had been allowed to say anything in the past few days, and it cost him more work. "All right," Katsuki broke the train of thought in the green-haired boy's mind. "I'm glad you let me know," he smirked and got closer again. "I wouldn't want my personal maid slacking on work," as he laughed in his lower voice. 1. "So today you can clean my room, the halls, the windows, the dining room, the statues and the stairs like usual." The emperor listed all of the immense things Izuku had to do in one day, which he couldn't even finish. "And to make things exciting, cook my meals, kuge?" Izuku quickly bit his tongue and corrected himself by bowing shortly in front of the emperor and just added in a monotone voice, "Yes, The 7. He quickly got all his cleaning supplies and started on the work he couldn't even finish yesterday. How was he supposed to do things on top of all of that today? He could almost punch himself in the face for using his words so carelessly. The emperor always had to have everything on time and had a demand for every occasion. He didn't accept anything less than asked, and his demands only seemed to increase. It's the last part which got Izuku so concerned. He was already at his limit. How could the emperor need more things? It became pretty obvious why no one could keep this job longer than a week. It was not only the emperor's high level of perfection requirements, but also the amount. Once he was done with the room, he moved over to the tall windows and later the stairs. His whole body was aching of exhaustion and hard elbow when he suddenly remembered the request about the food. Izuku broke his no talking demand and quickly ran towards the kitchen. He had to get a meal ready in less than half an hour. And not just for someone, but for the emperor himself, which made things even worse. Izuku couldn't cook at all, and the emperor had probably tasted the finest foods from every far country already. How would he be content with something simple? Izuku hadn't thought about all this before. The more he thought about all this and realized the fact that the emperor isn't clueless, the more Izuku seemed to think that the emperor might have known all of this already. The blonde angry man wasn't just letting Izuku F up his meal, but his last meal. Izuku rushed down the halls to the spot the old man had pointed at, naming it the kitchen. He had no idea what he could possibly make. 3. What do emperors eat? Izuku could probably not even think of the lux that the emperor takes for granted. The green-haired boy reached the bright, huge kitchen. He stood next to the stoves and ovens which still seemed to leave signs of use. Had someone already prepared food for the angry blonde? Izuku silently hoped that would be the case, since that would mean his chance of survival probably increased. Maybe the emperor had meant to lead Izuku to the wrong conclusions and this was all a joke for his entertainment. The green-haired boy didn't want to take that chance though. So he quickly grabbed some ingredients from the fridge. Since he had never cooked before, all he could go off of was his mom's small recipes. He couldn't waste much time on worrying whether or not that would be good enough. He found some vegetables to go off of and just cooked them in a big tall pot. The water cooked way quicker than at home, which didn't leave him much time to think of the next step. He tried to remember his mom's actions. He mimicked them to his best abilities, until he was left with a warm soup of the randomly grabbed ingredients. After a deep sigh while holding the hot pot, he could feel the courage sink in his shoes. This was not even close to being good enough. It was quite frankly more of a dead sentence than a soup. He then checked the time and noticed he was already half an hour late. He cursed to himself before feeling his survival chances go down even more. He ran back down the hallway with his pot on a cart, as he had added some bowls he had found in one of the cabinets. He softly knocked on the tall door with the golden sun art he had critiqued. "Come in," sounded from inside the door. Izuku took one last breath to try and keep calm when he then softly pushed the door open. To his surprise, the smell of amazing food was already inside the dining room. One Katsuki was waiting seated at the long wooden table in his golden tall throne. It's as if he knew Izuku was too late and had been waiting there in excitement for how the things would turn out. The greenette could already hear them ordering the guards to take him away. The big arms grabbing the smaller body and throwing them in the dungeon for a worse end yet to come. Izuku gulped the empty air that didn't fill with orders or words. The angry blonde just stared at him with a blank face in silence. But the green-haired boy didn't miss the small smirk creeping in his lips. Katsuki moved his hand to signal Izuku to come closer. The scent of amazing spices and herbs filled his nose, making him guess his choices. The smaller boy softly placed a bowl on the long table in front of the emperor and slowly filled it with the tasteless, now lukewarm soup. One Izuku's hands trembled as he tried to stay calm and collected, since couldn't let seem that he made a mistake. Katsuki smirked and let out a soft chuckle before mouthing an angry question. "Are you just going to keep standing there?" Izuku almost answered before realizing what that order had meant and just took a few steps back and lowered onto his knees. He stared at the cold white marble tiles as he heard the other moving his utensils. More than a soft chuckles and sighs of disappointment and disbelief Izuku didn't get. He couldn't quite guess what was going through the emperor's mind. After waiting on the floor for another 4 minutes, the emperor opened his mouth. Izuku clutched his black pants in anticipation of an order of death. "I've decided," he smirked at the other who wasn't allowed to look up, "you'll prepare my food every day." Izuku looked up in confusion and worry and spouted, "Wadash," before quickly gazing back down. He knew he wasn't allowed to talk, so nibbled his lip. "Talk," the emperor ordered as he now played with his empty wine glass. "You know I told you to stop biting your lips. I'm sorry and..." Izuku mumbled in fear and tried to settle his heart down. Last time talking made things worse, so he'd have to think about his words more carefully. Was tea the soup to your liking? Izuku then stuttered out slowly after a short silence of thinking. He earned a soft chuckle from the blonde man and then looked up at the feet that walked towards him. It was tasteless, bland, and had bad consistency. It was as if a kid tried his first time at cooking. He smirked down at the person kneeling in front of him. Looking at your scrawny hands and face, that assumption isn't far off. Then wi. Izuku asked, unable to speak his words correctly. He didn't look up further than the man's chest, but tried to gain more vision of the tall man's appearance. As if he had already forgotten, Katsuki waited and stared at the green locks in front of him while also trying to take in the other's face. He remembered being enchanted by the jade irises and the white pale skin painted by thousands of freckles. The only thing he was now allowed to see was his rare dark green hair. The emperor had gone against his rule of talking and could feel the urge to change his rule about eye contact too. He couldn't deny longing to see the other's face. He quickly shook away that thought and just answered with an angry tone. He spoke as he walked away from the small kneeling person in front of him. Just because I've now allowed you to talk, doesn't mean you have the right to an answer. Izuku looked down in defeat, since the emperor had had a point. He should be careful with his words so he didn't lose his voice by order. 8. I understand, and Izuku mumbled and bowed shortly, earning another content smirk from the other. One Katsuki halted in the door opening and looked back at the still kneeling greenette. Are you coming? He yelled back towards the other. My hot bath is awaiting my presence. Izuku jumped up as he froze. Hot bath. He had never had to bathe the emperor. The older servant had even said the man was very private about these things. 3. Izuku answered his usual words and quickly got up to the emperor in the doorway. He was pretty sure he could hear a hint of a chuckle. 1. Was the emperor toying with him? 7. If he did, was it normal? Did he always do this? What about other personal servants? 2 questions filled Izuku with doubt, as he followed the other man's lead. They reached a tall room with a golden wide bath. It could almost fit 8 people. For Izuku had never seen anything like it. In his village, people always used buckets to splash water over their bodies. Wasn't this a bit excessive? The emperor seemed so greedy. 8. Izuku turned off the water tap, when the water seemed to overflow the wide golden tub. When he looked back over the blonde, he had /ate himself of his clothes. Ike. Izuku screamed out shortly, as he quickly averted his eyes. I didn't know you dash, he began, but then remembered to not use needless words and kept silent. The blonde laughed strongly and covered his mouth. You're acting as if you've never seen a naked man, he chuckled out. 8. Izuku blushed deeply as he couldn't help but notice what had been between the other's legs. He had seen himself naked before, but could that even count as a man? 9. He started to doubt that fact now, since his was so much smaller. Did everyone have one like that? He shook the thought out of his head and just bowed with his eyes on the floor. 5. I'm so sorry. Izuku apologized and watched the man's feet dip into the water. Yo, you startled me, he explained as the emperor seated himself in the hot water. Katsuki put his arms over the edge of the tub and smirked. This green-haired strange boy sure was entertaining. Well, I couldn't have known my mere naked skin would have such an effect on you. 3. The greenette felt his cheeks become hotter, as he wished to disappear into the expensive floor. It was as if the emperor was teasing him like a child. So the boy quickly looked around to get the attention off of his heating cheeks. Which pro products should I use, sir? He asked as he stared at the numerous collections of luxurious soaps. Katsuki looked over behind him and seemed to think for a few seconds. Grab those light green ones, he then spoke with an evil smile. I just bought them. Since I recently started liking that jade color. 12. Izuku quickly nodded and grabbed the soaps. He kneeled next to the golden tub and coated his hands with the expensive product. His slender fingers trembled into the blonde locks of the man who had already closed his eyes. The greenette started massaging his head slowly. From this angle he got his first proper glance at the other's body. He could see the deep V-line and muscled stomach softly going up and down. The emperor's skin was a bit darker than the others and it carried scars from battle and war. It was obvious the man had fought to claim this position. His skin showed the struggle and harsh times he had to endure. Izuku couldn't help but admire that side of the angry man. Izuku's attention was grabbed by a deep diagonal scar from Katsuki's left shoulder blade to his left lower back. It seemed deeper, angrier, more painful than the rest. It was the only one that the man flinched at when being touched. Izuku parted his lips to ask, before quickly shutting them, remembering his situation. What would he even ask about the scar? It just tickled his curiosity. After softly soaping the other's hair, his eyes slid over the other's legs out of curiosity. He couldn't deny feeling the bottom of his stomach shudder by the thought of such a big thing existing. Izuku took a soft glance, but it was enough to realize that it was standing up to the surface. The 𝗧𝗵𝗃 flinched as he took his hands harshly out of the hair and felt his breath choke. The 𝗧𝗵𝗃 coughed softly as he heard the other chuckle in amusement as his hand traveled down. He wouldn't do something like that here, would he? Katsuki's hands softly started stroking up and down as he filled the bathroom with light relaxed groans of relief. Izuku's face lit up in shame. How could he do such a shameful thing? The 𝗧𝗵𝗃 stood up hastily and sprayed water all over the other's head and face, making the other stop. The bath filled with bubbles as the figure of the muscled tall man disappeared behind the white fog. Izuku almost screamed out in panic as the other seemed to comply and stood up from the bath. The shorter boy turned away from the other's naked body, unable to glance at it once more. "You can leave now," Katsuki ordered and smirked as he wrapped a wide towel around his body. "It's the hour of my slumber." Izuku looked up in disbelief and now dared to turn back around to the now less naked man. "It's so early, 𝗵𝗃," he brought out without much thinking. "You don't seem to get much sleep." Katsuki now looked at the other's face, clearly having forgotten to not keep eye contact. "Well, it's because I'm frustrated that sleep escapes me." He now did answer the other's question with a soft smile. "What frustrates you, 𝗵𝗃?" Izuku asked, worried it might be something he did wrong, as he then quickly pulls his eyes to the ground as ordered. But that answer did not get answered like his first one, as the emperor just smirked while the door opened as if on cue. 15 women walked in the room in fabricless lingerie. Plus the scent of all the female omegas filled the room like wildfire, but luckily Izuku could keep his face in control, since other omegas' smell didn't have much effect on him. Izuku's face became one big red mess again, as he realized what the evil smirking man had meant earlier. It was that type of frustration. Izuku had woken up, splashed his face water, already done some cleaning and even prepared breakfast early. The boy still couldn't get the image from yesterday out of his mind. Not only the omega woman that swirled around the blonde, but also what had risen from the bathwater. He told himself he probably shouldn't be surprised about all this. There of course was a reason he was only looking for betas to serve him around the castle. It's because he securely got served by countless omegas, but still. So many, Izuku still mouthed to himself while sweeping the hallways with a flustered expression. And so big, he now remembered the bath scene again with hot red cheeks and then harshly coughed to get it out of his head. Izuku had to admit, he had become a little more grateful for that guard who had miselected him. If he hadn't, he could have ended up doing such dirty things like that. Although fortunately for him, the emperor didn't seem to show much interest in men. The 𝗧𝗵𝗃 realized it was time for the emperor's breakfast, so hurried to the kitchen to get his prepared meal. When he knocked the door gently, the emperor opened immediately like usual. Unlike Izuku had expected, the man still looked exhausted. Katsuki scowled at the other, who quickly kept his eyes on the ground. "Good morning, 𝗵𝗃," was mumbled from under the green curls. The blonde didn't answer. He was busy staring at the red flushed ears that were sprouting out of the other's locks. Izuku could feel his cheeks glowing a fuchsia pink, due to the mental images from yesterday. He declared himself lucky for the no eye contact rule, because seeing and hearing the MSDR's voice again was only making him remember. "Breakfast is at the dining hall, huh?" Izuku broke the silence, as he used his right to speak that the other had given him back. Katsuki just stared another 20 seconds at the other's ears, almost curious about what they led up to, before passing the smaller boy. They both reached the dining table, as Izuku quickly kneeled down obediently as usual. The blonde started eating the prepared food slowly, as if lost in thought. He was clearly thinking all his rules over. Here, Katsuki eventually spoke his first word of the morning and threw a piece of paper in front of the other's knees. "It's a message for the king of the south," he explained, but only created more questions. 1. "We frequently conversate about military affairs," the blonde spoke with a neutral tone, but had to suppress his evil smirk spreading on his face. "In the south they don't speak our language," he chuckled out as he saw Izuku grabbing the paper. Izuku couldn't even read the letters. Did the emperor know he was illiterate? Why would he even order this task to a lowly villager? This made absolutely no sense. He recognized some of the characters, but he nobles used such formal words he couldn't make out a single word. "So just translate it for me, all right?" Katsuki smirked deeply and then stood up after finishing the whole plate. "I know this takes a couple of weeks," he admitted as he halted next to the other, who clearly panicking. "But I need it by tomorrow morning," he chuckled and then hovered his hand over the other's head, debating whether or not to ruffle through the fascinating green locks. 2. He remembered his words about touching a peasant, so quickly withdrew his hand. But how should I translate? Izuku then took his chance to ask a question as the other was already at the door. He knew that not finishing this task could get him killed. Moreover, saying he was illiterate would have the same consequences. "Well, I can give you a little hint," the emperor gave in, while leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. "Books?" he spoke in his deep voice, just before leaving into the long halls with loud echoing laughter. "Books?" 8. Izuku could almost offer himself to be killed with that hint. He got up and realized there might be a library in the castle that the emperor was talking about. So asking that to the old servant should be his first move. He quickly rushed out of the emperor's wing and to the other side of the palace where all the servants were located. He had been so isolated and alone for the past 6 days that it almost felt surreal seeing so many people at the same time. That thought made him halt, remembering the number 6. If the old man hadn't lied, this might actually be his last day, since no one lasted longer than 7. The greenette shook his head, knowing he had no time to dwell on those things. He suddenly saw the old servant, who was explaining chores to some younger servants. Izuku made his way over to the group and grabbed the man's attention with his ragged movements. Danjuro furrowed his brows and cocked his head to the side with an annoyed glare. "What do you want, boy?" he spoke as if scolding, and Izuku now felt all the younger people's eyes glued to his face. "Oh, I need to know where the library is, mister," he tried asking the abrupt question in the most polite way, but that didn't seem to help. All the younger people seemed to widen their eyes and some even gasped. It was clear no one dared to interrupt the longest working servant in the palace. The man didn't seem to accept the question either. He just rested his face in the palm of his hand and let out a deep sigh. Izuku quickly waved his hands in front of his chest to apologize. "So sorcery," he tried to backtrack as all the younger servants kept staring at him awkwardly. Majesty's orders, he blamed his question on the emperor, which indirectly wasn't incorrect. The people around him started whispering about the fact the small boy was the personal servant of the emperor. They were all fascinated by the idea and wondering how long it would take till Izuku would have to get replaced. Danjuro now lifted his head and quickly said, "Silence," to stop the whispering and rumors. "My best pupil will show you around the palace." He offered to help, very obviously annoyed by the interaction. But that's not needed." Izuku felt like a burden, so quickly just promised to find the library himself. "I can find the library if you give me some directions." The man looked at him in confusion, as if the greenette's words had made no sense. "Library," he repeated the other's words in a weirded tone. Izuku felt his courage sink all the way down to his shoes. What was wrong with that word? Was the library far? Because he didn't have much time to reach it and find the books. But to the greenette's surprise, the answer was even worse. "There are 8 libraries in the palace." Izuku's face grew pale as his lips thought of new words but came up empty. What had the man just said? 8 libraries. The greenette's courage from earlier disappeared like snow for the sun. 11, monsieur, the man spoke, as a familiar arose from the crowd of pupils. The woman smiled sweetly to the clearly stressed-out greenette. She bowed softly and then pulled her black ponytail to the side. "I'll assist you with the emperor's order," she brought out way too formally to Izuku's liking. "Oh, the thank you, miss." Izuku acted to be just as formal, but hoped they would drop the axe soon. Fortunately, he had been right because from the moment the woman had led him away from the teacher, she relaxed. "The first library isn't far, follow me," she spoke with a considerate smile and seemed to understand the other was in a hurry. Her expression darkened as she spoke sadly. "I reckon you also got taken by the guards." "Yes, I got chosen as the personal servant," Izuku admitted, knowing the other knew what that had meant. Momo seemed to bite her lip, not sure how to properly react. "I heard," she eventually said and grabbed the smaller man's shoulder. "It must have been hard." She spoke sympathetically with a worried expression. "I've heard many cruel stories of that man." "Oh, thank you for the concern." The greenette forced a smile as he lied through his teeth. "He's actually not all that bad. The last thing he wanted was for a rumor to go around about him complaining about the emperor." "Oh well, I'm glad you still look so lively," the woman said while nodding her head. "I already find my 𝗵𝗃 inconsiderate." She spoke with a sad expression, looking in the distance. "I can't imagine yours. What happened?" Izuku asked to the now pained expression the black-haired woman was wearing. She seemed to hesitate, but then confide in the smaller boy. "I was placed in the bakery at first," she explained. "I actually liked it a lot there." As her face suddenly grew more excited, "I could do what I had always done but on a bigger scale and with such luxurious products." When Momo mentioned her old village job, as if she had already said goodbye to it, Izuku felt a harsh pain in his chest. He had been so focused on surviving that he had forgotten all about everything in the village. "But then all of a sudden I got replaced," the woman continued, making Izuku look up in confusion. "I didn't even do anything wrong," she emphasized with an annoyed finger up in the air. "What happened?" "I don't really know," Momo answered with an empty voice. "They said people from higher rankings had lost jobs, so cut out the newer ones." She tried to explain with the words she had heard. "Now I work under Mr. Danjuro," she said as she shrugged her shoulders. Izuku wanted to ask more questions, but Momo pointed in front of them swiftly with a warm smile. "We're here." Her finger pointed at a tall door and they quickly entered, walking into a tall maze of racks full of books. Izuku's eyes widened. How many were there? "So what exactly are you looking for?" the taller woman asked as she lifted one of the books with great interest. "I reckon you probably don't have much time." "Indeed," Izuku chuckled out awkwardly, knowing he had absolutely no idea what he was looking for. "So something to translate the language from the south?" Momo's eyes widened. "The south?" She put her hand to her chin in deep thought and concluded, "That's a complex language with not many resting native speakers." She looked up at the wise pages in front of her. "I'm not even sure that sort of thing would be here." Izuku's face grew pale as he felt his heart sank. This would most certainly be his last day. He just knew it. This might have even just been a trap, just solely to get rid of him. Momo noticed the other's courage diminishing, so quickly recovered herself. "Boo, but we might." She tried to bring out convincingly while grabbing the other's shoulder softly. "I know some servants that were placed here after the bakery incident." She used her connections to get Izuku to smile again. Thank you, Momo." Izuku used no formalities for the first time, after the woman had asked it so many times in the village. She seemed to approve of that with a warm smile and then pulled Izuku to the servants behind the desk. "My friend here needs a translation book for the emperor." Momo pitched the problem to the servants. "For the language from the south?" She smiled with faked confidence, not really expecting much good news. "I don't think we have that here," the bubbly girl with a brown bob answered. She had this high-pitched voice as she sounded optimistic to lighten up the mood, "but I can look it up." She touched all 5 of her fingers together and seemed to read through the big catalog. "For translation books," she exclaimed and pointed at a big shelf in the middle of the library. "It might be there." She signaled the other servants to follow her as she walked confidently to the stacked papers. "That is a very amazing tool to communicate with the south," she explained, as she started to flap through the pages. "It would surprise me if the emperor just kept that laying around in the library." She looked back at Izuku, who also started to read some of the titles. "Most of these are for dialects from up-close countries," Izuku noticed and had to agree with the bubbly girl. "So you might be right about that." The courage really was decreasing when also Momo shrugged her shoulders. "Why did you come looking in the libraries in the first place?" The woman tried to find a solution as she holds her chin in thought. Izuku shrugged his shoulders and spoke about his one-word hint he had gotten. Books. The libraries would be the logical but time-wasting answer. The library girl interrupted the thought process. So that would be what he wanted you to think, she concluded, and then grabbed both of Izuku's shoulders. But some books are closer than you'd think. Think. For Izuku's thoughts stared at the girl, who seemed to come way too close with a determined expression, as he awkwardly smiled and tried to do as she asked. He thought long and hard for a few seconds, when all of a sudden everything clicked. 5. Goodness gracious, I think I know. Izuku leaves the two confused servants after yelling, "Thank you," and running back through the halls to the Emperor's wing. The Emperor had done this on purpose. He had known that the 𝗧𝗵𝗃 would go to the libraries. My room, he panted out of breath, as he leaned his hands against the door opening of his room. He stumbled to the shelves he had searched for an escape route, as he remembered the glue keeping the book stuck to the old wood. 5. There was this one book, he kept thinking out loud as he tried to remember where it was placed, that was not attached. His hands grabbed the rims of the books until one of them budged. This is it, he exclaimed almost in excitement, before that immediately disappeared, realizing he couldn't recognize a single symbol on the cover. He sat down on the little desk in the small room and lifted the heavy big book onto the wooden surface. He grabbed the piece of paper the Emperor had given him and started to look up every single symbol and translate it on another sheet. Izuku knew damn well this was going to take ages, but he knew his life depended on it. So hours went by until his room was too dark to see the supposed letters in front of him, so he lit up a tall candle and kept working. Maybe if he continued all night he could finish the letter, is what he kept thinking, as he tried to stay hopeful. Izuku kept getting stuck and having to change things, then repeating the same symbols without really knowing what they said. His eyes were drooping with heavy sleep. Since he never got to rest long in this palace anyway, exhaustion was catching up with him. He noticed the room lighting back up again, after he was just about to place his fourth candle on his desk. He signed in fear, knowing the time was ticking. It was already morning again. He should really keep working hard to get things done. Or at least that's what he thought, when suddenly he was woken up by loud banging on his wooden shelves. Eek! Izuku screamed out and shot up from his slouched position against his desk. His eyes widened, realizing he had fallen asleep. He didn't even remember finishing the letter. Did he even finish the letter? Katsuki slid his long sword back into its sleeve, after using it against the shelves. "Oh, so you were busy sleeping," the man spoke with a deep angry undertone. "I hope it was worth 𝗳𝗏. The blonde halted his sentence as the other crawled over the ground towards him. Izuku trembled over the creaking floor and hesitantly lifted his hand to the Emperor, who was still looking at him with a confused expression. Katsuki stared at the small piece of paper the other was flaunting towards him. "What's this?" he questioningly asked as he started folding open the paper. "What is this gibberish?" he almost cackled out as he started to read a certain sentence. "Hereby, piece of heart bringing love to any shells longing to the sea," for Izuku's small room filled with loud laughter, since apparently the Emperor could easily translate it back to his language. The 𝗧𝗵𝗃 could feel the other man lean over him and coming closer. "Is this supposed to be a love letter for me?" 3. Izuku's cheeks heat up in embarrassment and shame. He couldn't believe he had done such a bad job at translating. For all he knew, this only confirmed his last day had come. He tried to save it with the words he had left. No, 𝗵𝗃, the letter F for the king. "Oh yeah, right," Katsuki continued with a smirk, and covered his mouth with the piece of paper as he hid his obvious chuckle. "I forgot to tell you, I don't need any of it." The Emperor almost couldn't hide the obvious evil pleasure he had in this. "Did it take you long to come up with this piece of gibberish?" Izuku just nodded as he felt tears stinging his eyes. He felt so humiliated and used for something so useless. "I worked all night and day. That's why I fell asleep, Mom. Is that so?" Katsuki answered and seemed to bend even lower to try and get a glimpse of where the trembling voice was coming from. It was obvious the other was holding in sobs by the 𝗧𝗵𝗃's shivering back. "Guess you did all of that for nothing." The blonde was waiting for the first tears to stain the shiny tiles. "And haven't you forgotten our roles?" he wanted to add more pressure onto the new boy. It's usually not me, the almighty emperor, that comes to wake such a lowly peasant as yourself. 1. You want to be thrown into the dungeon, don't you? Those words hit Izuku right into the chest, with the feeling of an absolute crushing disappointment. He had done everything in his power to try and save his life, but it all had been useless. There was no winning this evil man's games. Tears started dropping onto the tiles and the 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗧 mouth slipped out sobs even though he tried not to. There was a long silence, as if the emperor was busy thinking about what he wanted to do next. After a cutting silence filled with sobs and whimpering, the emperor spoke his command. Look up. Izuku obeyed with clear confusion and hesitation. This was against one of the fundamental rules of the emperor. He softly lifted his head and revealed his teary cheeks and bright jaden eyes. It was the first time both of them saw each other's faces this clearly, as the emperor was bent over, causing their noses to be only inches away from each other. Katsuki gulped one of his breaths, as he suddenly was so close to his kneeling servant. He could finally see every freckle and detail on the other's face. He couldn't deny that the other was prettier than he had even remembered. The blonde quickly tried to recover and stood back up to create some distance, as he coughed to distract from his obvious admiration. You should get back to work, sleepyhead, he then called his new demand, as if he was back to normal. I'm waiting for breakfast. 14 Izuku wiped his tears a bit, as he quickly pulled his eyes to the ground again to accept the demand as taught. He brought out in the same broken, distraught voice. Suddenly he felt the emperor's hand on his chin, lifting his gaze back up. No, look up. The emperor seemed to have changed his second fundamental rule, as he now also seemed to have broken his own third. By touching the lowly skin of a peasant with his divine hands, it seemed the emperor had never been as honest as now. He revealed his true intentions for the first time. 5. I want to see your pretty face. Izuku stumbled over to the kitchen. His body felt so heavy due to the lack of sleep. He was pretty sure he got only a minute of sleep due to the letter. He wiped his tears from earlier off of his freckled cheeks. 2. He just felt humiliated and useless. He had worked so hard for that letter and it turned out to be useless. He was sure now. The emperor really was just playing games with him out of boredom. He just wanted to test Izuku's limits. The 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗧 grabbed most of his ingredients and started preparing a quick meal. I'm already at my limit, is what he could only tell himself due to his teary, swollen eyes and foggy, sleepy mind. After a few minutes he could finally place everything on his cart and start wheeling it outside. Suddenly a woman came through the door, before he could. She looked at him with a distasteful glare, as he noticed she seemed to work for the bakery. Who are you? She immediately started accusing, as her eyes seemed to take in every detail of Izuku's awful condition. You know that only culinary servants are allowed here, right? She crossed her arms with a fierce frown on her face. The servant of the emperor, Izuku started to explain in a guilty tone as usual. The personal servant? He tried to prove his statement by showing his piteous meal on the tray. The woman just answered with a frown, so it's you who he suddenly ordered to cook for him. The 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗧's brows furrowed in confusion. He has a whole team of culinary servants to prepare meals for him. Izuku's eyes widened. What? He couldn't believe he was apparently the first servant who he had ordered to do this task. What was the emperor thinking? It all didn't make sense. So, and normally she doesn't. The woman slapped her hands together to get rid of the resting white flour. Of course not, you little runt. She started walking towards the door again, as if she was done with this conversation. You're the reason we all lost our positions, you little... 12. The door slammed shut and Izuku was left speechless. No wonder the room had always smelled like food just before he came in the dining room. The emperor was just always sending them away. The 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗧 tried to shrug it off and pushed his cart towards the door. He didn't have time to worry about all these things. All that mattered was the emperor's mood today, since that would determine his lifeline. When he got halfway through the door, someone behind the door pushed the heavy wooden door back shut. Izuku squealed out as he lost balance and landed on the floor next to all of his now broken plates. His heart sped up, realizing he now had lost even more time. He had already been late and now this. The emperor would for sure not forgive him anymore. No, 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 he kept bringing out as he tried to save whatever was left on the ground. Tears started stinging his eyes again as he tried to fight them. He blinked a few of the hazy figures away as he kept scraping the ground for the shards. Suddenly he stood eye to eye with an expensive big shoe. Izuku's heart stopped as he slowly dared to look up. Are you always such a klutz? Katsuki asked to the person below him, or did you just start to like kneeling at my feet? The blonde smirked out with a soft chuckle. No sorry ma I just fave. Izuku immediately started to apologize to save the situation, as he could finally get the last things off of the ground. He stood back up softly, as he noticed the emperor cocking his head to the door with squinting eyes. Didn't I tell you I hate liars? Katsuki spoke daringly as he leaned over the smaller boy with a teasing expression. Izuku just kept his head on the ground, not really sure what that sentence had meant. Izuku then quickly rushed to the big bowl, where had made the pathetic little yogurt mix and made a new bowl with red flushed cheeks. The emperor now sure wouldn't like his cooking anymore. As Izuku placed it back on the now dirty cart and started moving it forward, the emperor blocked his way. Let me carry, the blonde almost ordered with the same angry scowl. You seem clumsier than usual, 24. Izuku just obeyed and then watched with widened, confused eyes, as he trailed like a lost puppy after the emperor with the cart. People around the palace stopped and stared at the unseen sight. Most of them had never even seen the emperor from so up close, since he never came to the culinary wing. As they finally reached the dining hall, they both came eye to eye with the personal culinary team. Izuku almost gasped at the amazing smell coming from the door, and as he reached inside, the whole table was filled with delicious meals, fruits and drinks. He had never seen such luxurious foods in such numbers. It almost seemed unfair. Sire please, we prepared every single one of your favorites. The tallest man of the bunch started speaking desperately. Just have a bite. Take it away, just sounded a single authoritative demand from the blonde next to Izuku. The greenette could hear the others' soul shatter in the short silence, before they started taking everything back up their trays and took their leave. They all glared at the two people standing by the door as they passed. More specifically the shorter greenette, who was standing next to the pathetic small meal the emperor apparently preferred. Izuku kept his eyes on the ground, as he fidgeted with his hands nervously. As the culinary crew had left, Izuku quickly got to his usual place on the ground and kneeled. He took a few deep breaths trying to feel calm again. Today the emperor seemed so different, and it was scary due to his unpredictable behavior. Izuku never thought he would say this, but he wanted things to return like they were. No looking up at his demands, no talking, no cooking, no helping. Just cleaning in silence. He suddenly perked his head up at the man who apparently had halted before him. Plus, why don't you sit at the table with me? Izuku fidgeted with his hands against the expensive fabric laid out on the table. He had been waiting in long minutes of silence, as the emperor had dug into the small meal the greenette had made. Eventually Izuku couldn't help it anymore and opened his mouth towards the person in front of him. Why do you order to take the dishes away? Katsuki seemed to brush his chin with his hand in thought, as he watched the long table that was creating a long space in between the two of them. I wonder, he said without much of an expression to read off of. Do you think what was cooked by your clumsy little hands isn't to my liking? The blonde now asked his question with a smirk as he cocked his head a bit to the side. That it's tasteless or badly flavored. Izuku shook his head, since it seemed the emperor was accusing him of something. And no, sir. He looked up into the far but burning clear crimson eyes of the other. It's just that he sighed and answered with words he would later come to regret. It's just not comparable to the culinary servant's expertise. The emperor seemed to suppress a loud laugh and pulled his head back into his throne. Okay, he smirked out and leaned onto his hands, creating a small bridge for his chin. It was obvious the man was thinking of some weird games again. After a silence of the blonde just completing his thought process, he stood up with an evil smile and walked towards the greenette. When he finally reached the other side of the table, the silence was growing thicker. Suddenly a strong lemon tea smell made its way into Izuku's nose. The greenette flinched and felt his breath choke on the sudden cold air. What was this? He had never been able to smell an alpha's pheromones before. 3. He tried to suppress some coughs, but they quickly wanted to spill out, as he covered his mouth while his eyes teared up. How was someone's smell so strong? He couldn't risk the others see that he could smell it. The Emperor might not even have noticed that he was giving it off. 7. After a short second, the tall blonde leaned over the other smaller man. He grabbed the edge of Izuku's seat possessively and demanded strong eye contact with his burning eyes. So, he started as his nose seemed to almost touch the others. 2. So you would rather eat those foods? Izuku couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief, as it seemed the other man hadn't noticed his earlier behavior. But what came next is what made Izuku's heart beat faster again. Together with me, of course, Katsuki added with a sly smirk at the other's already baffled face. 8. After a long silence of Izuku trying to figure out what answer the Emperor wanted, he still came up empty. Was this a trap? He hesitated, but then decided to just give an empty answer. Whatever you like, be best. 1. The taller man started to smirk from up close and then stood back up. You sure know how to please my ears, he brought out, seeming content with the given answer. Well, he announced as he sat back down before his meal and continued eating. If it's my choice to make, I'd like to dine with you this evening. 3. I have an exciting announcement to make for you, he exclaimed with dangerous pleasure. Izuku could only feel his palms sweating and his heart growing colder. This could not mean any good at all. For the Emperor seemed like an excited kid, waiting for his favorite game to start. It was all just too obvious to the 𝗓𝗏𝗏. This was going to be his last day. He felt he would be robbed of his life tonight. 3. And frankly, he couldn't have been more right too. Izuku couldn't help but feel distracted while doing his daily chores. Everything seemed unable to occupy his mind, other than the timer that seemed to tick away the last hours of his life. He was on his bony knees cleaning the stairs, when suddenly a servant walked up to him. Monsieur, are you the Emperor's personal servant? 2. Izuku looked up in shock at the new face, since no other servants ever come to this wing. The man had purple sparkling eyes and blonde longer locks. He had a weird accent, almost as if he was from a further region. Weiss, Izuku answered, scared to admit that fact. Was he already going to get killed? The man clicked his fingers as 2 other men joined behind him with expensive fabrics. The blonde man seemed to decide which fabric to work with in an instant. 1. His Majesty has ordered me to make you appropriate dining attire, he explained, after reading the confusion coming off of the other's face. Your eyes and odd hair are quite unique, Aoyama admitted and already started to walk away with his hands behind his back. 3. The man swiftly signaled Izuku to follow. With other words, you're a difficult subject. Izuku didn't understand how this was needed. It almost seemed like a weird ritual would take place and he could guess who'd be the sacrifice. But Aoyama halted suddenly and turned towards the 𝗓𝗏𝗏, who still hadn't spoken a single word. Don't worry, I'll make you sparkle, he exclaimed as little tiny stars seemed to shine in the man's eyes. 2. Izuku just smiled politely, since the man seemed so harmless. The thank you, sir, he stuttered with a hint of fear still hidden under his words. The man seemed to hear that hint, so tried to reassure the other with his soothing words. After all, dresses are my specialty, 𝗧𝗵𝗃 dress. Izuku almost yelled out in confusion. What do you mean? He tripled after the taller blonde man already hurrying to the measuring room. Wait. 7. What, Monsieur? The blonde stylish man spoke with an obvious accent and hint of annoyance through his tone. His Majesty has ordered his wishes, he explained clearly in a hurry. I had nothing to do with it. But I need this ready before tonight, he continued and gripped the fabric in his hands tighter, clearly under stress. So just follow me, Aoyama brought out with a deep frown and continued towards his sewing station. The 𝗓𝗏𝗏 stumbled after him obediently, clearly feeling the other man's nerves. He didn't feel like complaining about the dress anymore at all. He could only focus on how this outfit choice would be a spectacle for the Emperor right before Izuku's death. The 𝗓𝗏𝗏 flinched out as a needle seemed to pierce through his skin. The needle is in my high hip, he whined out softly, as if debating whether or not to agitate the other even more. Stop moving, Aoyama just answered with a cold demand, as he repositioned his pin with a deep sigh. It felt as if he blamed the 𝗧𝗵𝗃 for his own little accident, as he positioned his last markings in the fabric. Since your hair is such an atroce couleur, I think just black must be safe, he explained, more to himself than to the people in the room, since they didn't even understand his dialect words. Cette couleur will make your hair pop. After the last pins pinched Izuku's pale skin, he could take the fabrics off again, so that the man could make the last stitches. The 𝗧𝗵𝗃 just bowed and thanked the clearly dissatisfied blonde, since he knew it would probably be his last. The thank you, he mumbled out, and to his surprise got a rather positive response from the man, who now seemed to bring out a slight smile. This gave Izuku his last shred of courage to just ask his lingering question. Has the emperor ever ordered something like a dinner with new clothes before? Aoyama looked up from the fabric he was sewing and seemed to hesitate to answer that question. He sighed, not wanting to be the bearer of bad news. Well, not in my 10 years of working here, monsieur. To be quite honest, I pray for your soul. 18 Izuku walked into the dining room as the servants just took their leave and shot him with angry looks again on their way out. Izuku sure couldn't blame them though. Why was the emperor dining with his personal servant? He walked towards his usual spot on the floor next to the table, when the emperor immediately brought up his hand with dissatisfaction. What are you doing? Was the question echoing into Izuku's ears, who was staring down at his hands in his lap. I just thought laughter interrupted the other's excuses before they could finish. You're hilarious, Katsuki snickered out, before then suddenly changing back into his cold, daring expression. Sit across from me, sounded a cold demand after, like an actual worthy dinner guest. As the 𝗧𝗵𝗃 got up, he could feel the other's eyes running up and down his thighs, because of his new acquired clothes. He could even hear a small chuckle from behind his back, only solidifying this was all just a joke to the emperor. Izuku slowly sat down softly onto the expensive fabric of the chair across from the emperor. The long table created a wide distance between the two of them, yet the tension seemed at an all-time high. Dig in, sounded an excited voice from the blonde's side, as he waved a soft gesture with his hands. I wouldn't want to force you to process the surprise on an empty stomach, he seemed to warn the other with an evil smirk, making Izuku's heart race in the silence. 11 The 𝗧𝗵𝗃 could feel the other's dangerous enjoyment with every bite he took from the expensive prepared goods. As if with every bite, the excitement from the emperor grew. He was clearly waiting for something, which made Izuku even more nervous. When Izuku took his last bite, he finally dared to pull his eyes back up to the distant person in front of him. Katsuki leaned on his one hand with a devilish smirk, as if savoring the innocent expression from across the table. After a few seconds in silence, the emperor finally stood up to walk over to the other side. Katsuki pressed his big hands on Izuku's small shoulders, as he leaned into the other's ear from the side, with a crazy expression. Why do you think I didn't make you cook today? Izuku frowned at that question in the long silence, but still came up empty. He could hear his heart beating out of his chest. Sorry, I don't care. He apologized in his usual soft, fearing voice. Okay, Katsuki gave a short answer to the confused tone and then switched ears with a smirk. He leaned Izuku's other shoulder and just continued with a new question he clearly already knew the answer to. Why do you think I chose you out of the thousands of people I took from the villages? But also that question, Izuku couldn't answer. He just bit his tongue in a deafening, dangerous silence, as it eventually filled with a short chuckle of satisfaction. Katsuki seemed to narrow his question even more. Don't you think you belong in another job than the kitchen? 6th question made Izuku's heart sped up and obviously fill the silence with its loud thumps. I don't know, the 𝗧𝗵𝗃 just decided to play dumb, since he was already helplessly trapped. That feeling only grew when the big hands that were pressing on his shoulders slid down to his thighs, as the 𝗧𝗵𝗃's hands instinctively tried to peel them off. What do you mean? But Izuku was cut off short, when his voice lost all strength with the emperor's next menacing words. I mean, your gender usually serves people in other ways, 𝗬𝗵𝗃. I wasn't quite sure at first, Katsuki continued as he now buried his nose in the other's nape. But you had this addicting scent, he smirked and inhaled the other's faint but sweet smell. 7. How the hell did my guards select a stupid omega off of the street to serve me? The blonde seemed to glint at the 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗧 obvious shivers going along his back. "You're way more useful doing other things," he whispered in the trembling person's ear. The big hand that had been touching the other's thighs now started to slowly spread them apart. Izuku froze and tried pressing his legs together, but the other just kept going, clearly unfazed. "From day one I was suspicious," Katsuki spoke, now more explaining than menacing. "But then your body reacted to my pheromones so desperately," he chuckled, humiliating the other even more. 6. Your scent is unlike anything I've encountered before, the Emperor noticed again, as he pushed more of the dark curls aside for more effect. "It's so faint, yet so addicting." He pulled the other's shoulders up from the chair and pushed him onto the table. Izuku felt his feet lift up, as if ready to kick off the other's hips that were nearing his thighs. The Emperor ignored the 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗧's clear unease and leaned over him, as one of his big hands pinned the other by the throat. "I wonder what you'll smell like once I send you in heat," were the menacing last words, before the blonde forcefully started kissing the other's neck. He nibbled onto it and tasted its scent. Izuku could only let out, still unable to process the situation. How did the other suddenly know he was an Omega? I mean, he wasn't even an Omega. He was recessive, so this was all for nothing anyway. The smaller boy pushed his hands on the other's chest. "Off." The 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗧 couldn't finish his sentence due to his lips being sealed by the other's rough kisses. Why was the Emperor being so aggressive? It was all scary. Izuku tried, but couldn't get the Emperor off of him with no luck. 8. Katsuki forcefully explored the other's small mouth with greed. He didn't apply more pressure on the other's throat than needed to keep him in place, since the other seemed short on breath even with small kisses. The blonde smirked at the teary flushed mess underneath him and slid his hands under the other's clothing. The boy's thighs felt so smooth. He was way more into this than he had thought, since he had never tried this with a man before. The 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗧's cute and innocent expressions were quite pleasing, and even his soft resistance with his weak hands seemed to increase the rushing heat in his chest. He started to crave the other's scent and small noises more with each kiss. Izuku finally got the strength and opportunity to kick the other in the stomach. He pushed himself off of the table and burst out in tears due to the alpha's big demanding hands. "No, Peely, please," he yelled out desperately as he stumbled over the floor. "Don't do this." Katsuki watched the other crawling over the floor, as if the blonde himself was a scary monster. His brows furrowed in confusion. Why was the other not begging him like all other Omegas had always done? For he was a tall, appealing alpha, 𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏, and the Emperor at that. Why did the servant boy not just comply to commands like always? This was more frustrating than the blonde had thought. He almost felt sick, insulted. "I'm a recessive Omega." Izuku screamed out as he seemed to shield himself from the other's lurking vision. "So I won't go into heat." He begged the other again, still haven't noticed the other's puzzled expression. Please, Don, don't waste your time with me. I'm as good as a beta," the 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗧 kept begging in his now trembling high-pitched voice. His throat was dry and tight, which made him lose his voice. "So just let me continue in this position." The Emperor's permanent smirk had faded for a while now. He had had multiple people who had denied one of his demands, but this for some reason felt different. His chest seemed to tighten with an unpleasant feeling of despair. The blonde had always had an answer right up his sleeve for disobedient peasants like the one in front of him. He'd always call straight for the guards and get them killed or tortured, in methods that depended solely on his mood. But this time he came up empty. He had never felt this insulted in his mighty life, so there came a new pattern of thought with different outcomes. For a second he wanted to agree with the smaller boy's statement to continue his position. "Wasting my time." He changed his mind in an angry tone. Thinking about all this was exhausting. The Emperor had a routine, like always, with the same decisions and same effects. That's how he liked it, so he quickly returned to his old self, but wore his smirk less confidently. "No." The Emperor seemed to hesitate on a demand for the first time. "You can't bargain with me." Katsuki signaled the guards at the wide doors with a swift hand motion and pointed at the defenseless person on the ground. "1, guards," the tall blonde yelled out from the private room, as armed tall men rushed into the room with cold faces. They waited for a few moments in their needed formation and stiff pose, as the emperor, again, seemed to think over his words. Take him away. He eventually persevered and pointed at the now crying little ball on the floor. The men roughly grabbed at the other's arms and pulled him off the floor coldly, ignoring his cries of pain. 𝗬𝗪𝗲 please. The 𝗲𝗵𝗃 screamed out, 𝗬𝗪𝗃 please. He cried, leaving a trail of tears where he was dragged. I beg you. He could only call out desperately to the face he couldn't even see, only for Izuku to immediately realize that the emperor cared so little that he didn't even seem to think his own crying personal servant was worth looking at. But in reality the blonde couldn't quite look at what his finger was signaling at because of some stinging inside his chest. The sounds the other was making were awful and could be felt through the emperor's bones. 3. What was this? Some curse. Katsuki suddenly seemed relieved that the other was gone. There was definitely something wrong with that boy. Izuku got thrown against the rough floor after descending millions of stairs. He was definitely underground in the dungeon. It was so cold and dark. Let me talk to my 𝗬𝗂. The 𝗲𝗵𝗃 screamed out in one last attempt, but the guards don't even listen and just walk off. 6. Izuku held onto his chest as he panted out in exhaustion and disbelief. Things couldn't have gone worse. It seems his time had come. His mind was all over the place, only to realize that the inevitable had happened. He took deep breaths and seemed to calm down after some time. For all he knew, the emperor didn't actually kill people and just wanted him out of his palace. He nodded, trying to fill his head with these positive thoughts. Suddenly the silence in the room was broken by the loud sound of metal in echoing chambers. Hello. Izuku stuttered out into the darkness as he noticed a dark figure in front of his cell. It was another inmate, seated on the ground, trying to get a glimpse of him with a confused expression. It was a woman with pink skin and pink appealing short locks. She had dark but clear hazel eyes, which were peeking at the other. You're the girl from Dash. The boy started, the answer he stopped, realizing he didn't really know what word would come after. He had expected that the girl from the first day would have been dead by now, but yet here she was fully alive. Did that mean Izuku also wouldn't get killed? Yes, you probably recognize me, she smiled softly, since she clearly was still scared. How did you get here? She asked as she held onto the iron bars, trying to make her face more visible in the dim light. The 𝗲𝗵𝗃 took a deep breath, as if thinking over what exact wrongdoing he did that got him here. To his knowledge, he didn't quite do anything. So it was hard to think of some explanation. I think I will work too slow, he answered quite shortly. What happens to us down here? He asked as he mimicked the other's gestures and put his hands on the cold iron bars in front of him. The woman's face immediately darkened with a pained expression. It depends on the person, she admitted, as she left a short silence before giving an example. There was a boy that got here about 2 days ago and he got dragged off this morning. She seemed hesitant about the last words. He never came back. Izuku's heart thumped in his chest. The positive words he had been trying to force into his brain seemed worthless and like complete lies against reality. Some of us get killed, Mina spoke in a low tone, as if her voice threatened to disappear. Others get some time. Izuku realized that both of those options had the same ending. It all depended on how fast the emperor wanted you to die. I just want to go home, Izuku cried out now, as all emotions spilled out instantly. He became weak in the knees, as he cried in silence against the cold floor and stone wall. What did he do wrong? What did he do to deserve this? His mom was probably worried sick and he would never ever get to see her again. He hadn't said goodbye and hadn't even had the chance to say how much he loved her. The thought of him deserting his so terrified mother gnawed at his heart. She probably already had felt miserably worried during his week of absence. More tears stained the ground by that thought. Are you in a dress? A soft question broke the sniffles of the boy in the darkness. Izuku looked back towards the other and nodded at her confused face. She clearly had never seen a male servant in the women's attire. 2. 𝗬𝗵𝗃. He made me wear it for the diner, he explained after wiping his tears off of his freckled cheeks. To his surprise, the others seemed even more confused about that answer. Like the emperor? She asked in a doubtful tone, gaining a soft nod from the other. So wait dash, she paused for a second and got closer to the iron of her cell. You worked for the emperor? She couldn't quite believe the statement. So you were the personal servant he chose. Izuku kept nodding to every one of her little questions, as her face dumbfounded and then pained since she probably couldn't bear bringing more bad news. What's wrong? Izuku couldn't quite help but feel worried. What did that little detail change? Mina started very hesitantly. It was clear she was finding the right words to her answer. I've heard some stories in my time down here and she sighed deeply and continued while whispering. Everyone in here ends up getting killed, but it is said that the way and how that happens usually depends on the emperor's mood. Izuku felt his brows furrow in despair. This all could only mean more bad things for him. And the stories about the personal servants were definitely She paused again in her uncomfortable position. Well, let's say the most painful of deaths. A long silence followed of Izuku's heart and mind just pounding. Too cold sweat was running down Izuku's back. This information was all too much. He couldn't breathe, since it felt as if his throat was swelling. His hand pressed against his numb neck, trying to make it easier to breathe. I'm so sorry, sounded a soft whisper from the other side of the dungeon. But I think down here, Mina brought out with a sympathetic frown, as she saw the other almost began to hyperventilate. But she couldn't sugarcoat the truth. You won't last long. The door to the dungeon opens and reveals a tall, muscled, red-headed man. The smell of warm soup fills the cold cells, making Izuku sit up and get closer to the bars to see what had just come inside. The red-headed man crouched over to the pink girl's cell and opened her cell to hand her the bowl of hot soup. He wiped some dirt off of her face and then whispered some encouraging words to her. Kirishima then gave her thigh a comforting squeeze and got back up to lock her cell back up. Izuku seemed to realize why Mina had lasted so long here. The prison guard clearly had taken a liking to her. He could probably pull some strings to give her more time. Which also means that didn't apply to him and that his hope from earlier was futile. Izuku watched through the big iron bars as the tall redhead got back up and carried a bowl to his cell. Kirishima suddenly halted. What? He paused and then crouched closer the other with a questioning look. Aren't you the emperor's personal servant? Izuku nodded softly with a guilty but mostly fearing expression. How did this matter? Was he already getting executed? Oh, Kirishima brought out with a pained expression. He clearly felt guilty as he walked past Izuku's cell. Wait! Izuku screamed out through the echoing chambers. Please sir, I don't get it. The man walked backwards a bit to reach the other's cell again. Kirishima's voice was low and husky, because he clearly didn't want to explain. The personal servants don't get food down here. Izuku's heart faltered at those words. No food? Was he supposed to die of starvation? The greenette felt tears stinging his eyes as he broke down on the cold floor. His hiccups could be heard through the echoing cold walls. Please, Izuku sniffled out with last hope. I just want to go home. His request was hardly denied by the loud bang of the door to the chambers slamming shut. Izuku was again left alone in the darkness, with only his hot tears warming his face. Mina looked down at her liquid food. She was unable to throw over the bars even if she wanted to. She couldn't swallow the food, due to the deafening cries from the other side of the dungeon. This had never happened since she got down here. It was the first time she realized that it was not her, but this boy that seemed even more unlucky. After a few minutes, the door to the cells opened back up with a loud creaking noise, when two tall big guards made their way to Izuku's cell. Izuku didn't even have the time to wipe away his tears to see them properly, as they already pulled at his limbs. Izuku felt the rough floor cutting open the fragile flesh on his thighs. Oh wow. He struggled in their strong grip. Please stop. The greenette cried out in pain, but the others paid no mind. Mina watched helplessly as the other got dragged out of the room with no mercy. She had never seen somebody leave as soon as him. She couldn't imagine what was waiting outside for that boy. Izuku knew for sure he was being executed. He could only hope it wasn't with much torture before that. Shivers went down his spine as he was left trembling in the strong guard's grips. Please let go of me. But none of his begging or pleas made the guards slow down. He was pushed down onto hard concrete, slicing his knees open, earning another desperate cry from the greenette. When Izuku got some of his vision back after wiping at his tears, He noticed the emperor on a high stone throne in front of him. Katsuki was looking down at him with a cold, emotionless glare from his podium. Before the 𝗲𝗏𝗏 could find words, a tall, dark-clothed man joined next to him. He wasn't dressed like a guard, but Izuku only had eyes for the tall axe he was holding with ease. Should we start cutting of his fingers, Your Majesty? The man spoke with chilling casualty. The guards grabbed Izuku's smaller body and pushed him to the ground, bruising his ribs. The 𝗲𝗏𝗏's lungs felt crushed to the point he couldn't even breathe. Wow, the 𝗲𝗏𝗏 cried out, No, please don't do this, please. Katsuki watched the tears leaving Izuku's eyes, staining the cold, dirty floor. He couldn't help but painfully recognize them from earlier. The tall, creepy man held up his big axe higher, as the other guard forced his heel sharply against the boy's wrist so they could make a clean cut. Izuku closed his eyes, ready to scream them back open to look at his dismembered fingers. He felt tears slipping from behind his closed eyes, as he trembled all over. He couldn't get out of the grip from the guard's heavy metal-plated foot, so was rendered helpless. All he could do was spend the silent seconds imagining what pain it would cause him and noise his fingers would make, once they were severed. He wanted to scream, as he heard the axe making a windy sound in the air. Wait, Katsuki demanded and brought his fingers to his chin. He watched as the 𝗲𝗏𝗏 opened his eyes again and trembled all over. Katsuki could only think about how angry he had been and had looked forward to this. Then why didn't watching this appeal to him? He had always done this to disobedient peasants, and it had always pleased him. Let him go, he ordered at the guards, as they quickly lost the grip on Izuku's small shivering body. Are you sure, Your Majesty? The man with the axe asked in clear confusion, since this had never happened before. He swung the axe in the green-haired boy's direction without much thought. Katsuki unconsciously held his breath, as his eyes widened towards the most horrifying outcome. He felt his chest squeeze with that same horrible feeling again. He suddenly screamed out in impulse, "Grab him!" He had just yelled the same command again, but now pointed at the tall black-dressed man. The guards escorted him out, after some seconds of looking at each other in disbelief. Katsuki put his head in his hands and left out a sigh in distress, after he was left in the silence only filled with Izuku's cries. Now what do we do with him? One of the guards asked and hovered awkwardly over the crying boy who had balled in on himself. Bring him to my room. The emperor walked past his sleeping chambers for the fourth time, wishing there would be silence from the other side of the door. But again there could only be sniffles and hiccups heard from behind the expensive silk threads, suiting as a door. Katsuki sighed in a disappointed and annoyed manner, as he finally gave up and pushed his rough hands through the silk to make way inside. He watched the scene unfold, just like he had expected. The green-haired boy hadn't moved an inch since he first left, but more worryingly he still hadn't stopped crying. Izuku was still hunched over into a tiny ball in the corner of the emperor's big sleeping quarters. Tears were miraculously still streaming down the other's distraught face that was hidden between his knees. His salty tears were mixing with the crimson bright red blood seeping down his legs from earlier's execution. Katsuki still couldn't name the feeling he was feeling, but he swiftly wanted to get rid of it. So he walked up closer to the little ball of a crying mess and pulled out the bucket of lukewarm water he had ordered. The sniffles behind the still favored jade-colored hair grew in pain, as the emperor started to gently wipe at the cuts on Izuku's knees. The emperor still hadn't spoken a word, nor had the 𝗲𝗏𝗏 moved. It wasn't sure who'd first break their pattern. Katsuki dabbed the cloth softly onto the pale sensitive skin, as the blood transferred into the bucket of the relaxing water. The green-haired terrified boy seemed to calm after realizing the caution the other was moving with. Izuku felt the urge to look at the other, but that meant swallowing his pride, since he couldn't bear the other's gaze. His curiosity grew at the soft movement, unable to believe it was really the emperor touching him so dearly. He eventually couldn't help it anymore, as his eyes started to drift to his knees automatically, trying to reach the blondes. But when his eyes landed on the expected target, the emperor was nowhere to be seen. Izuku stared at the empty air before him, feeling his breath shake as he watched his now clean knees. He felt his heart still throb at the events from earlier and the cold sweat leaving a shiver from his neck all the way down his spine. The greenette quickly forced his eyes back onto his belly as he watched the tall blonde walk back into the room. He bit his lip to silence his breath that still seemed shaken. Katsuki ignored the boy's mannerisms and just crouched down onto the floor. The emperor mixed the expensive prepared wine with oil and honey in his bowl to treat the wounds carefully. He opened his mouth, as if he wanted to say something, but eventually just sighed back into the silence. 3. He plastered the mixture onto the rough cuts, earning more sniffles and pained whines from the other's mouth. Katsuki almost rolled his eyes as he grabbed more cloth to bandage the other's knees. How could that boy still have the power to make such annoying sounds? 6. He gently wrapped the thin soft cloth onto the other's skin with care, as he watched him still shake due to the endless sobs. After a long silence, Katsuki finally gives up and asked his first cold, emotionless question to the shaking boy. "Why are you still crying?" 6. When the other only seemed to flinch as an answer to that question, Katsuki continued in his deep, rough tone. "Shouldn't one grow tired of crying for such extended periods of time?" But also that didn't seem to compel the other to speak. For the emperor sighed again and decided to try something else. "Stop crying," sounded a harsh apathetic demand, like the hundreds Izuku had been forced to follow before. It was a stark reminder of his days as a personal servant that had led to this moment. But to Katsuki's surprise, the once so loyal servant still couldn't be swayed. After another short silence of the emperor thinking over what could make the other stop crying, he still couldn't find an answer. So decided to ask the person himself, "What should I do to make you stop those tears?" Katsuki's voice now seemed desperate, restless, and almost weak, which grabbed the greenette's attention immediately. Izuku finally moved up his head to meet the crimson, despairing eyes. He watched with disbelief, catching the emperor's lip tremble. He hiccuped and answered in an even more pathetic tone than the other. Had used, "I want to go home." A long silence ruled after the other had finally used his strained voice. It sounded weak, unstable, and exhausted. The silence almost made the greenette believe the emperor was quite actually thinking his wish over. Izuku stared with an almost baffled expression at the thinking face of the other, but quickly looked back down in emptiness at his answer. "You know I can't do that," Katsuki answered, not in a demanding nor harsh tone, but in the softest voice he'd already used. It was clear he was trying to explain a feeling he couldn't quite understand himself. Why did he not want the green-haired boy to go back home? Was it because of his ethereal Jaden beauty? One, because of his pleasing mannerisms? Because of his planned execution? Because of his first rejection? The emperor was left empty to any of those questions. He was only certain of 2 things. He didn't enjoy seeing the other be executed, nor does he want to let the other go. What feeling was stemming from that was yet a mystery to be unsolved. 16. The answer had made Izuku sink back between his knees and hiccup harder, as more tears stained his now carefully bandaged knees. Katsuki watched as the other seemed to break down all over again, and felt his chest harden with the same pain as before. He knew he shouldn't say it, he knew saying it would make a mess, but he couldn't help say it. "How about I let you see them?" Izuku stared at his fidgeting hands on his thighs, as he bounced up and down due to the carriage's movements. He didn't dare to look up at the blonde's face on the other side of the vehicle. 5. Not because the rule, the emperor had once implied, but because every time he looked up his eyes would meet with a troubling gaze. Katsuki's crimson fires seemed to bury themselves deep into the boy's jade ones. He was trying to read thoughts through Izuku's pupils. What was he thinking? The blonde was trying to distract himself away from his troubling thoughts by busying himself with his previous appealing personal servant. He had never gone to the village, nor did he ever think he would do something stupid like this. 2. Being among the peasants was the last thing a divine source of power was supposed to do. Every minute the urge of ordering the carriage to turn around became stronger, but for some reason he wouldn't. That reason being the appealing peasant in front of him. Izuku had stopped crying, and that, to Katsuki's surprise, had made him feel pleased. He hadn't chosen a new personal servant yet, and so it seemed rendering the boy of his place would be the next step, but for some reason the blonde didn't quite want that. He didn't want the green-haired boy to serve him anymore, nor did he want him dead. He wasn't quite sure which next orders he was supposed to make, which was why he was staring at the person in question to get some answers. One Izuku kept staring at the outside window, which seemed to look more and more like the landscape he had always known. He couldn't wait to see his mother he had missed so much. He had so much to tell her, although he doubted about what parts he could tell. The past 24 hours still swirled around in his mind like a plague of deaf tones. With touch of his fingers on his palms, he could feel them getting severed. Only thinking of the palace again makes his heart race with terror. Although he couldn't question why someone as cold and disciplined as the emperor seemed to have changed his mind on the last chord. The blonde had seemed to grown even more impulsive and unpredictable. What was he thinking? Suddenly the carriage came to a harsh stop, as Katsuki's gaze finally left Izuku's face. The emperor seemed to sigh, still unsure of why he was allowing this. He adjusted his heavy iron sword into its sleeve and his expensive jewelry around his neck, before stepping out of the carriage. He had his nose tilted, as if already disapproving of the peasant smell he was descending in. Izuku hastily followed and looked upon the main street where all of this mess had began. His eyes widened at the obvious destruction that was still there. Windows had been broken, walls destroyed, and many belongings were gathered into a big piles of ashes after burning them. There was no one to be seen where there used to be a busy market by day. Izuku was speechless, as the freezing breeze made the cold sweat on his neck break. He hadn't known the magnitude of the damage that had been done by the soldiers that day. The 𝗧𝗵𝗲 choked on a breath, as he started looking around for a single soul. Izuku noticed the doors since only shortly locked. The villagers were hiding. He turned towards the curious blonde who didn't want to admit his interest in these small houses. As soon as Izuku's gaze reached him, he quickly halted and crossed his arms. What seems of the importance? He spoke cocky with his nose still tilted. Izuku shook his head with a sigh, realizing the emperor wouldn't understand even if he explained. Nothing, he decided to just leave it for now and started his journey running up the hills towards his mother. Wait! The emperor brings out in a panic and runs after the 𝗧𝗵𝗲 to grab Izuku's wrist. His grip rather strong, since the feeling of the other leaving made his muscle tense up with despair. "Just stay close to me." Katsuki's words were sad and desperate. The same desperation Izuku could read in his eyes. The emperor's face was painted with a soft expression full warmth and care. He was speaking as if the words had rolled over his tongue without a single thought. While carefully thinking over his words was something he always did. When Izuku felt his wrist bruise, he pulled back as he whined out, "Ouch!" Izuku looked away from the emperor's eyes with determination. They were full of desirable things he hadn't seen in the blonde before. Almost as though the painful grip was a needed cruel reminder of reality. His eyes were saying things Izuku didn't want to see. "Okay," sounded in Izuku's soft angelic voice. "I was just trying to reach my home," he explained to a clearly freaked out emperor. He didn't want to make the emperor lock him away into the dungeon again. But Izuku suddenly seemed to read more than just anger off of Katsuki's face. It was fear. A fear of letting Izuku escape. A fear of the abandoned village. A fear of being left alone here. Izuku suddenly flinched as if the answer had come to him. Was it a fear to lose Izuku? "You're my personal dirty peasant," the blonde then tried to play it of, as he started marching in front of the 𝗧𝗵𝗲 with a cocky tone in his voice. "I can't have you escaping with your ratty little feet." Izuku first wanted to believe his threats, as he heard the disgust drip off of the emperor's words. The man seemed to think so low of Izuku, although the still burning mark on the 𝗧𝗵𝗲's wrist made his real thoughts more clear. He seemed weirdly attached. Izuku ran up the familiar hill, ignoring the annoyed groans coming from the blonde behind him. As he reached his front door, his fist started slamming on the green wooden panels. He yelled. "I'm back. I made it out, please." His desperate words were met by empty silence, as if no one was home. He ran up to some windows and only then realized they were boarded shut. Was his mom still even in the house? He felt cold sweat run down his back. He had been so desperate to see her and had felt so close to finally meeting her again that now it all hit him like a brick. He looked back at the blonde with a worried expression. Where did she go? But all he earned from Katsuki was a shrug of his muscled shoulders. Izuku felt tears stinging his eyes, not only by the crushing disappointment weighing on his back, but also by the pure indifference the other was poisoning him with. He quickly turned back around to wipe them away before the emperor could see. He could already feel the next harsh comment come. "You're not crying again, are you?" Those words would have been the nail in the coffin, when suddenly the door slowly creaked open. There didn't seem to be anyone behind the door until dark teal locks appeared behind the painted wood. A small voice sounded hesitant and uneasy with one word. "Izu." Izuku stood there in disbelief for another 4 seconds, staring at the familiar hair strands and warm voice. The figure seemed too scared to come outside or face the guests at her front porch. Before Inko could hear her small word answered, her son flew around her neck. Izuku burst through the door and clinged onto the other, as he cried onto her shoulder. Inko soon also couldn't help but let tears tickle down her cheeks. There were no words spoken, as if they both knew what the other had gone through and that it was too hard to talk about. Katsuki could only stand there in silence with his arms crossed. He tried to look away at the further trees, but could feel his gaze pulling towards the heartfelt reunion. The silence only felt with small whimpers and sniffles, as they sobbed against each other. One Katsuki watched the way the 𝗧𝗵𝗃 clinged onto the other with infinite affection and warmth. He couldn't deny he had wished to be that person for the 𝗧𝗵𝗃 just once these past few weeks. The emperor noticed his chest clenching at that thought again. He hated it after the long-felt hug. Inko finally let go of her son and noticed the tall, muscled noble in front of her. Her eyes widened as words escaped, looking at the 𝗧𝗵𝗃 for answers. She thought Izuku had managed to run away. Then why was there a noble joining him? "This is the emperor," Izuku explained in a stutter, a bit uneasy on how his mother would react. "He allowed me to see you." He tried to gauge Katsuki's emotions to know how he was supposed to act according to his wishes, but came up empty since the emperor's expression was unreadable like before. Inko only then noticed the golden expensive jewelry and royal beadings across the other's clothes. Emperor. She stuttered out, completely terrified, knowing that this was the man that had ruined their village. Izuku tried to answer, before being interrupted by his mother pulling him inside the house. She slammed the door shut and barracked the door as she was used to. "Wait, Mom." Izuku tried to protest, but could already hear the fury awakening outside. "How dare you!" the emperor yelled and slammed his fist on the front door. "You worthless peasants, come out now," he threatened as he already pulled out his sword, pure aggression running through his nerves. He didn't know what was feeding his anger. He tried to tell himself it was the deceiving personal servant, or the annoying old lady not respecting his royal rank, but a part of him realized it was clearly something else. The risk of losing his most longed possession. He stuck his sword right through the green wooden panels before slicing the door open. "I will kill both of you," he menaced, driven by pure anger and anguish mingling to a dangerous mixture. He then quickly reached the 2 villagers hiding under a table, after swinging his sword around. He pulled both of his hands under the other's hiding spot and threw it in the air like it was nothing. His anger fueled his strength, as he stuck his sword right in front of the villagers' faces. He reached to carve something into Izuku's cheek. "No, please." Inko screamed out and jumped in front of her son. "I'm sorry," she begged out blindly and kneeled onto the ground in despair. Please don't hurt my son," she cried out onto the dirty wooden floor, as Katsuki took in the pathetic sight. "YC can make me work for you," she continued, "or take all my belongings, torture me, who hurt me and even kill me," she cried out with determination that made Katsuki frown with an unknown feeling. Please don't hurt him." The emperor just stared in silence at the sobbing mess with the same frown, almost knowing how he felt. He then looked up at the boy, who was sniffling while shaking his head with a begging expression. The appealing boy's tears again earned by his rougher actions. Why did this irritate him so much? He had heard many of these pleading words of people hoping that he would take a life for another. Not a single one made him sway, but the terror this boy's mother had fought through to see her son and try to protect him without a single weapon was different. Katsuki felt his jaw clench at the pure fury at the realization that the woman in front of him would give up all the listed things for her son. He hated such weak people, but had never met one with such sincerity in one's words. It's almost as if he felt jealous. 16-2 Katsuki stared at the boarded shut windows and frantically spread junk all throughout the dirty house. Did people actually live in such disgusting places? It made him pull up his nose, as he heard another train of apologies from his servant's mouth. He isn't going to who hurt you, Mom. Izuku tried to explain the situation for the 20th time to his terrified mother. We just shouldn't provoke him. The brunette tried to sound convincing, not sure if even he himself believed his words. Do you always live in such trash? The rant was broken by the tall noble facing away from them, who clearly had heard enough of their annoying words excusing his behavior. You should be glad I pulled you out of this place. He blurted out, unable to hide his jealousy from earlier. Inko furrowed her brows with clear hate and determination, but before she could speak, her son takes over. You admitted all happened when you invaded our village. He hesitated, stuttering over his words. It's normally not like this. He didn't want to annoy the emperor, who clearly already seemed to be in a bad mood. All Katsuki could hear was another insult. He turned around threateningly, leaning over the shorter green-haired boy with menace. So what you're saying is that I caused this mess? His voice is a low rumble from his chest, making a shiver run along Izuku's spine. The brunette quickly shook his head to try and change his words. A sorcery, that's totally not what I had meant. He couldn't help feel his cheeks glow with shame and fear. How could he still not just normally speak without offending his 𝗵𝘃𝗲? I promise. No, Katsuki protested out, smirking evilly, as he leans back and chuckled in a low, threatening rumble. Those other peasants think like that too, right? He cocked his head to the side slowly in a threatening manner, as his eyes reached that of the woman further away. I'd like to claim whatever misery I've brought on other people with excitement. The emperor scoffed, unable to hold the snicker covering his dangerously sharp features. So please, he leaned over the other again threateningly, enlighten me. Seeing all those heirs piss their pants at the mere sight of me is exactly what I need right now. Before Izuku nor Inko could bring something of reason out of their tight throats, they watched the tall, powerful man walk out of the broken door. Izuku quickly turned to his mother, holding her hands in his hands to warn her. Stay here, Mom, he begged, knowing she won't want to leave him. I know it's weird to believe. He pressed his eyes closed, almost feeling dumb for his next words. But the emperor still hasn't killed me. There is something holding him back. He watched the disbelief color his mother's already pale face. I don't know 𝗬𝗍𝗵𝗃𝗲, but if you come he might kill you. Inko shook her head in protest, unable to let go of her son. Izu, I really can't, she cried out, tears already streaming down her face, as the worst possible outcome flooded her mind. You might die. Her hands clutched her son's in a desperate manner for certainty. Izuku felt the time thinning, biting his lip before quickly grabbing his mom in a strong hug. He pressed his nose against her shoulder, knowing this might be the last time to hold her like this. The emperor might never allow him to come back. Or even worse, kill him. Trust me, he spoke now much stronger as he pushes out of the hug to look her right in the eye. Before Inko could answer, her son had already started running behind the absolute monster roaming the empty streets. Come on out, you little shits! Katsuki yelled at the first house he had reached, before thudding his loud fist on the wooden old door. Can't make me wait. He grumbled angrily, busting through the wood. Wawatnu. Izuku struggled to follow behind his strong, wide strides, reaching him in panic. He gasped for breath, his small voice trying to form words. Please you should go be back. Why you already granted my wish? He tried to convince the furious man in front of him. Your Highness has more important affairs to attend to. How had the emperor changed so suddenly? It was clear something had caused this immense change in the other's behavior. He was lashing out because of deeper emotions from within, but Izuku couldn't quite tell which ones. So he was rendered helpless, as Katsuki roughly threw his elbow back to get free. Ouch! A loud cry echoed through the empty streets, as Izuku's body thudded on the harsh floor. His hand automatically reaching for his pained nose, feeling thick blood running down his face. Izuku felt the courage sink in his shoes. How had he thought the emperor would listen to him? He had wanted to make his mother feel safe so desperately that he had started to believe himself. Now he just realized he had been delusional. The BLD pooled on the floor, a thick crimson mixture reflecting his uselessness in the situation. He shouldn't have come to the village. Now he might have caused more people danger. He shouldn't have said that thing earlier. He shouldn't have believed the emperor had showed some change. When suddenly Izuku's blurry vision due to tears revealed the blonde kneeling in front of him. His raspy voice, thick and annoyed, maybe even hiding concern. "Why do you dumb but have to be short?" He blamed Izuku's height for the miscalculated aggression. It wasn't supposed to hit him in the face. It was meant as a push against the chest. He tried to still the BLD, watching those sad appealing eyes again. He wasn't supposed to be affected by this. "Get up. You need a physician," Katsuki yelled behind at the greenette in his cold, stoic voice. His little servant was still left on the ground, after Katsuki had debated carrying him. The blonde walked back into the direction of the carriage that took them to this confusing hellhole in the first place. Katsuki could no longer deny feeling some sort of warmth towards that little 𝗧𝗵𝗲. This couldn't mean anything good. Izuku rubbed his eyes weakly, blinking against the faint sunlight peeking through the curtains. As expected, he was met by those golden tall walls again, towering, empty, sharp. He let his hand fall from his face, making it land on the bedsheet like a feather. He watched his pale, thin complexion reflect the sharp daylight, then the bandages covering the scrapes from harsh concrete. He sighed sitting up in his bed, memories of yesterday flooding back to him. He still felt sore. Not just his nose, but the rest of him. His heart had bruises too from fear, hope, the confusing mix of both. His toes tapped the cold white tile floor slowly, his eyes heavy with sleep, and barely noticed the gentle knock before a servant peeked in. "The emperor has summoned you," the butler spoke politely, though his eyes darted to the floor. It was clear Izuku wasn't the only one who was taught to never dare eye contact. Izuku's face paled at the announcement. The cold emperor had clearly deemed going to the village as a mistake. He seemed to regret giving the greenette a single piece of freedom or mercy. It was clear he'd make Izuku work again like before. Only able to abide every rule, wishing to live another day. Izuku nodded, before following quietly through the halls that still felt too big. Every footstep echoed twice through the eerie silence. His footsteps small, insignificant in the king's tomb. He expected the emperor's room or that he'd be thrown into the kitchen for the emperor's breakfast. But to his surprise they passed through the throne hall, then the second library to the north wing of the palace. Izuku felt his breath hitch. This isn't normal, where were they taking him? The servant then turned the corner and opened a set of tall glass doors. Izuku's mouth fell open, gasping as the warm air filled his lungs. The scent of grass, flowers, and nature filled his senses. It reminded him of anything but the palace. It reminded him of the village, the forest, home. When his eyes finally focused at the flowers in perfect bloom, his eyes widened. Tears involuntarily blurred his vision, as the sight was all too familiar. It wasn't a garden. It was his garden. Too exactly as it had been behind his house. The patches of tulips, the hydrangeas tucked in the corner, the little fence made of bent wood they probably had someone recreate based on memory. Not his memories, although they spoke loudly. There was only one other person in this empire that had seen his garden. The emperor too. Every flower was the same. Only cleaner, neater, just like his childhood, but perfected and controlled. It was almost like the emperor had not only wanted to recreate, but outdo his mother's and Izuku's work back in the village. Izuku took one step forward, then two. His feet crunched against white gravel. The petals swayed gently in the breeze like they remembered his scent. His mother used to pick the orange marigolds every spring. He bent down slowly, reaching to touch one. It even smelled the same. He knelt, his eyes closing with burning tears. As if he was trying to hide the emotions this whole garden was surfacing within. "Why?" he whispered aloud to no one. His voice cracked pathetically. Why would he? He bit his lip and pressed his forehead to his knees, curling into himself. His chest hurt. His hands trembled in his lap. What could the emperor mean by all of this? Was it a peace offering? Or was it a walking reminder of what Izuku could never go back to? What was he supposed to feel? Was he grateful? Was this supposed to make up for the BLD? Was it supposed to soothe the fear? Questions twisting in the greenette's mind, highlighting his twisted feelings. Izuku didn't hear the steps behind him. Do you like it? Katsuki brought out in his low, rough voice. Some familiar, making Izuku's breath catch in his throat. He felt his hands shiver in his lap, his lips tasting salty due to tears reaching the trembling pink surface. He wanted to scream. He wanted to hit him. He wanted to ask why, but instead he just stared at the marigold in front of him. As if the soft breeze carrying the scent of the flowers could answer his questions and soothe his mind. Izuku hesitated, lips parting against the knees he so desperately clung onto. You are the real one, he eventually whimpered against the fabric with a tremble in his voice. The words seemed to make Katsuki pause. The blonde watches the small crouched-over mess on the floor in front of him. His tall frame hovering over the boy, another depiction of their toxic power imbalance. After a short pause, the blonde answers coldly, his voice monotone, careless as ever. I know, he states, announcing another short silence filled with Izuku's small whimpers. He then clears his throat, looking up from the small crying mess, as if it hurts his eyes. Then don't cry over the new one, Izuku's earlier words still RNG through the Emperor's head. He hadn't expected it to sting as much. He clenched his jaw tight, as if it would relieve the tension in his chest. Why had he even bothered? What was he doing here? Hovering like some idiot over a sniveling peasant. One he had never even liked gardens. And yet he found himself kneeling anyway. He didn't touch, just close enough to see the slight tremble of the boy's thin shoulders. Close enough to feel the other's heat. Close enough to see the other's pale hands tremble over some worthless flowers. Katsuki's hand hovered over the other's head, wanting to feel the soft curls that had started this whole thing in the first place. They carried that addicting scent that had made him choose him, want to touch him, want to ravage him, devour him. The Emperor paused at that thought, his eyes widening with an unknown feeling. Was it self-loathing, guilt, shame? He retrieved his hand back, as if he realized it might scare the other, who still hadn't looked up once. I thought you'd like this dumb flower, see, the blonde then muttered, standing up again too quickly, brushing invisible dirt from his robe with disgust coloring his features. You're always going on about them. Izuku swallowed another sob, lifting his head up from his knees, just enough to see the edge of the garden again. His vision still blurry, making the colorful flowers haze into a familiar mixture of heliotrope. I do, for Katsuki's chest itched as he brought out the word, good, before thinking. His voice softer than earlier, making him quickly look over back at the palace, while hardening his sharp features. He grumbled in his same cold voice, then shut up and keep liking it. The Emperor turned to leave, but only got 3 steps away before stopping again. He clenched his fists, tightened his jaw, as he sighed with annoyance. Why was it suddenly so hard to walk away? After a short silence, he eventually parted his lips, waiting for his voice to come out. He mumbled 6 words almost too silent to be heard, clearly not certain whether or not he deemed Izuku worth of hearing them. I didn't mean to hit you. Katsuki's voice came out too sweet, too soft, too weak. It made Izuku look up in surprise, turning towards the palace, almost unable to hide his curiosity towards the hidden apology's owner. He planted his hands into the rich now soil, as he looked up at the tall figure. Mixed feelings twisting Izuku's stomach made his throat come up empty. Before he could think of a fitting answer, the blonde had already started taking his leave. Izuku had not even been able to take a glance at the blonde's expression once. He tried to brush it off, letting his hands ruffle the petals carrying the close, warm memories that still ended up feeling too far. His tears now halted, his vision now clear, as the same curiosity kept plaguing his mind over and over. What had the Emperor's face looked like when speaking with that sweet voice? The blonde boy shivered in his heavy armor, looking anxiously around the spectators. He felt tears stinging his eyes, as he tried to hide them behind his helmet, his hands trembling against the heavy spear he was holding. 3. He should be excited, since it's his turn to participate in the coming-of-age ceremony. Katsuki had finally reached the age of 12 since being born a prince in the Empire. He felt his racing heart clenching in his chest at the sight of his mother. She seemed to look down at her fidgeting hands, ignoring the desperate eyes of the boy standing in the middle of the raging crowd. The dismissal made the doubt curl even colder in his stomach. The field suddenly grew silent at the sound of the drums. The blonde realized it was time, as they echoed across the clearing like heartbeats. The scent of blood, sweat, and crushed grain filled the air, clogging his already tight throat. Ahead of him, the handlers were already releasing the young boar into the ring, a snorting, foaming blur of muscle and fear. It already charged towards the little boy standing in the middle, his grip tightening against the spear. Every powerful family's child in the empire had done the same ceremony before him. His father had slain a wild lion at 12 within seconds, cold-blooded, without any fear. His cousin, a big bull that had almost taken his head. Katsuki was only expected to take the throat of a boarling, but even then the rules made him shake in his armor. His father's voice repeating the rules echoed in his thumping head. Don't shame your name. Don't hesitate. Don't miss. Katsuki lifted the spear at the boar that was now nearly towards him. His skin scraping against the harsh wood, as he suddenly hesitated, seeing the boar's eyes. They were dark, wide and darting. Full of fear just like him, he suddenly thudded against the harsh sand, since he pulled out his shield just in time. His little body scraped against the unforgiving ground, as the boar cornered him. It snorted towards Katsuki's neck with a feral growl. Just before it could reach the boy's throat, its own throat got cut, making blood splash across the field, onto Katsuki's new armor. There followed a loud bark of command and then laughter, sharp and cruel from the nobles watching behind the velvet canopy. He had failed by breaking every single rule the handlers had stepped in, finished the kill with practiced ease. The animal squealed one last time, before then falling limp, inches away from the panting boy. Katsuki wiped the blood off his cheek, immediately looking for his mother in the crowd. When his eyes reached her earlier seat, she seemed to be gone. His chest tightened with the heavy feeling of lost affection, but the silence that followed was worse. As they announced the expected heavy footsteps, they were precise and slow, crunching through gravel like a sword being unsheathed. Katsuki kept his eyes low, as he had been taught, but even the dirt beneath him seemed to shrink. His father stopped beside him. The man didn't speak, didn't curse, didn't even raise a hand, since he knew he didn't have to. His voice was cold, a low grumble, as his expression read nothing but disappointment and rage. You looked it in its eyes, the emperor finally said, as he buried Katsuki's forgotten spear in the gravel with uncovered fury, making the little boy flinch. What a waste! The emperor's gaze swept down at the boy who would carry his name. Just a shaking child in armor, weak, slow, wrong. He turned, his luxury robe brushing against the boy's arm like a brand. Next time, he said, low enough for only the prince to hear, make it suffer, or I'll make sure you will. The palace had fallen into a strange rhythm. Or maybe Izuku was the one who had changed. His pulse slowed, his fear no longer as sharp but dulled into something like weariness. He wasn't sent to scrub every floor, stair, or window anymore. It was the new servants that handled the hard work. They polished the floors until they shone like wet glass, laundered the emperor's robes in whispered circles. They all couldn't help but gossip about the new boy that apparently had survived the emperor's execution. People spoke about the new garden that had been planted for that same odd person. There was jealousy, envy, and hidden wonder behind their words, but Izuku felt the eyes on his back burn through his dress. Izuku's list of duties had been quietly reduced. He still rose at dawn, still knelt for orders, unable to speak before permitted, still in his unfavored maid's dress. Most time he spent awkwardly following the emperor around, almost begging to be given a task. But Katsuki didn't speak unless strictly necessary. Most days, the emperor passed him by like mist, ignored him for hours as he made the greenette follow him around. Izuku only earned a short flick of the wrist, a short glance, a wave of dismissal, when having to kneel beside him during important meetings or when he was to be bathed. But even then the boy noticed the changes in the quiet. Late wakings, late dinners, broken glasses, lost items all didn't earn him as much harsh words than before. The new garden's gates were always open with an inviting scent. Izuku spent all his days in it now, because even after hours of being covered by the sweet hyacinths, hiding against the soft soil, no one came to fetch him. He'd even start humming again, only softly, to the plants. Old lullabies, forgotten village songs, or sweet songs his mother would sing while gardening. He caught himself flinching at an approaching shadow, expecting the tall blonde to scold him, but Katsuki never once showed up. And yet, something shifted each time he looked up and found that imaginary silhouette lingering. Like warmth pooling in his chest against his will, something like shame or longing, or some combination that felt worse than both. Why did he suddenly start imagining the Emperor being so close by him when he was not? Shouldn't Izuku be full of relief to not be under the Emperor's cruel gaze anymore? Izuku's small hands trailed the marigolds, as his fingertips stained green. His chest squeezed with an uncomfortable, shameful emotion. Why had he thought he was special? Why had he thought he would be different? Why had he thought he had meant something to him at all? When now it seemed so clear, plus he had lost the Emperor's favor. The knock was like a hammer to Izuku's skull, making him shock awake against his new soft sheets. The Emperor had assigned him to a new bigger suite in the same wing. He still couldn't get used to waking up in the bigger space. Izuku sat up, the thin blanket tangled at his ankles, breath catching as the heavy oak door creaked open. The morning had barely broken, as a gray-blue hush spilled into his quarters. Normally he wasn't up, boy, came the gravel and sand voice of the head servant. The Emperor's wrath doesn't wait for dreamers. The greenette blinked his tired eyes open with a questioning look. The old man's cold aura made him remember the first days in the palace where he had met him. He had never been woken up by the head servant, so something must be terribly wrong. The old man stood framed in torchlight from the hallway, wrapped in his long dark coat, before Izuku could ask his intentions. Denjuro's gray eyes scanned the hallway with disdain, already moving on in his mind with new chores. 𝗬𝗏𝗧𝗏. Izuku stumbled upright, fingers fumbling with the hem of his simple tunic. Denjuro had disappeared before Izuku had swung his feet off of his bed. What's happening, sir? Izuku stuttered, disheveled and stumbling in the men's footsteps. The fire festival, the man snapped shortly without any context. And you're late. Denjuro brought out angered, but still too busy to deem Izuku worthy of eye contact. He turned briskly around the corner and disappeared down the corridor without waiting for a reply. Izuku scrambled after him, half-dressed and full of questions. Denjuro was a figure made of marble and thunder, skin like worn parchment, hair snow-white and pulled back with strict character. No one in the palace dared speak to him unless spoken to first, except Izuku, who was foolish or curious enough not to care. "See, sir, what festival?" he asked breathlessly, trailing him into the bustling heart of the servants' wing. Izuku's bad stamina leaving him panting between syllables. The kitchen was alive with clangs and sharp voices, as steam clouded the high windows. Trays of shaped sugar lotus, roasted meats, dyed rice, and gilded fruits were stacked on massive carved tables. So Denjuro didn't stop, too busy yelling at the hurried servants. He just waved Izuku off with an annoyed tone. "The fire festival," he repeated. "An old tradition taking place every 11th day of the Sweet Oak Nights. Powerful alphas come from across the realm to court His Majesty." Court him? Izuku accepted a swinging tray of duck legs in his smaller hands, as he blinked at the idea. As in dash. His questioning tone earning a frustrated groan from Denjuro. It seemed obvious the old man only answered the greenette's dumb questions because of his relationship to the Emperor. As in marriage, the man growled impatiently before he scolded another servant for placing the wrong color of fruits around the plates. "Don't be daft." Izuku nodded shortly to the other servant, before stumbling with the plate behind the rushed man. They turned down the hallway that led toward the outer courtyards. Every few steps, Denjuro barked a command at flinching servants. Izuku hurried to match his pace, gaze flicking around at the furious preparations, garlands being strung across archways, musicians tuning lyres in the shade of the garden trees, servants polishing candelabras with lemon oil until their fingers were raw. "How many people come here to marry him?" Izuku asked, breathless again. Dozens, Denjiro said without looking back. Hundreds of powerful nobles send every single one of their daughters to catch the emperor's eye. He flicked his wrist, signaling Izuku to put the plate on one of the garden tables. They come from the farthest of lands, but not a single soul can gain Majesty's favor, it seems. What do you mean? Izuku asked hesitantly, running back from the table he was assigned to. Denjiro then suddenly halted, caught off guard by that question. Well, he suddenly spoke a lot softer now, as if only the Greenette was allowed to hear the words. Crude whispers are spreading about how the Emperor might prefer cheap omegaverse over powerful high-ranking alphas. He's the first emperor to turn down even the Princess of Solaria, Denjiro brought out with a clear furrow of worry covering his worn-out face. She was radiant, appealing, educated, bred for royalty, but still he refused. Denjiro looked out the window lost in thought, as if he had forgotten Izuku was listening. His words laced with worry. This way nobles might grow to despise him. He suddenly turned sharply, robes flaring, already on his way to chastise a servant. Mishandling a golden urn. He didn't look back at the Greenette, who watched the old man's hurried steps disappear around the corner. He wondered with a confused expression, realizing he shouldn't have heard those ntmt words. Izuku fidgeted with his hands as the words echoed in his head. Not a single soul can gain Majesty's favor. The image bloomed unbidden in his chest of the Emperor, crimson eyes, standing on that high dais as hundreds of desperate alphas knelt before him in rows, dancers in veils, warriors in brocade. Izuku's stomach knotted, as his fingers curled around the rough seam of his tunic sleeve. Why did it matter? He should be happy the Emperor would finally find someone to rule beside him. That would be his only chance to go back to the village, live in peace with his mother. And yet he felt it again, that shameful heat pooling beneath his ribs. It wasn't quite sadness, not quite jealousy, just that same heavy ache that came from the moment Katsuki started looking right through him. Tonight's festival would only prove his painful suspicions true. The small shameless connection he had began to feel for the cruel man had meant just as much as his fading delusions. Mere shadows of treacherous warmth. The candlelight flickered low when Izuku pushed open his chamber door. He had returned to his suite after he had felt out of place between the gossiping glances from the other servants. The festival was about to commence, but he could only focus on the dread forming deep in his chest. The air was still, heavy with lavender from the festival baths, but colder somehow. The servants' quarters had long emptied, since every hand was needed in the banquet halls, preparing for the most lavish night of the year. Izuku, placed in the Emperor's wing of the palace, however, still stood hesitating in his suite, debating whether or not he should even show up. He feared the Emperor's wrath if he didn't show up, but could feel he wouldn't be noticed if he did. With that thought, he suddenly noticed a uniform neatly folded across the bedding. His eyes widened as his stomach sank with a cold feeling pooling in his chest. It was not a robe, not a dress, not one of the silk ensembles he had worn the past few weeks, after the Emperor had worn a cruel smirk and ordered the Greenette to wear it. The Emperor had enjoyed the other's humiliation and also beauty, but that behind denying words. He was only looking at the dark clean lines of a regular servant's suit. Soft black cotton with a tight collar, an ironed hem, functional and anonymous. Just like all the others. Izuku moved to it slowly, his pale fingers brushing the fabric as though it might disappear. The threads felt coarse under his thumb, as if they were meant to blend in, not stand out, to be hidden, unseen, forgotten. He turned his hand palm up, watching it tremble. He furrowed his brows, feeling ridiculous. Why would he care? Why would it matter if this uniform meant that even that small attention of cruel, twisted kind of toxic poison was gone now? He sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, trembling. The cold fabric of the uniform pressed against his thigh. It shouldn't matter. But it did. Because deep down he realized he'd already gotten infected. This wasn't just clothing, this was dismissal, straight from the Emperor's silent orders, and Izuku felt it deeply eating at his chest. He couldn't help but wonder, stupidly, if Katsuki had known he'd see the parade of noblewomen, their waists cinched, gowns glimmering like starfields, their practiced eyes sweeping across the throne room, and decided that Izuku no longer needed to wear finery. Why would the emperor need to see him in anything special? Izuku thought bitterly, fingers tightening in the stiff fabric. He now had an entire ballroom of beauties dressed to please. He stood in the servants' hall hours later, wrapped in the 2 straight lines of the uniform. He blended in easily. No one stopped him. No one recognized him. The entire palace was lit with firelight and music, as long crimson banners billowed from the balconies, and the scent of spiced meat and syruped figs drifted thick through the halls. Every alpha woman there looked like an empress already. Izuku slipped between them like smoke, as the festival had already begun. He felt his gaze involuntarily sweeping over the ballroom, looking curiously for a specific blonde. He tried not to flinch at the laughter that rang out in the upper tiers. He could hear them, the foreign dignitaries with their 2 practiced accents, praising the imperial court, as they raised their glasses just a touch too fast. They were all hurriedly trying to gain a certain person's attention, laughing fakely behind full glasses and twirling their expensive fabrics, reflecting in the soft light the countless chandeliers in the throne hall. Katsuki sat in the center, leaned back in the throne like it bored him. His crown was askew, as he listened to the intentionally ceesy voices complimenting him. Izuku watched the long line full of alpha women waiting to impress the majesty. Each of them stood tall, elegant, their hair like molten gold, soft sweet brown or dark embers, laughing at something he didn't respond to. Katsuki's eyes weren't even on most of them. He just stared unfocused in the distance, leaning his chin on his hand in disinterest and boredom, before he faked a soft chuckle to signal them off. Only a few women gained a short word from his lips. Some even an approving smirk, as he thought one was pretty. They all twirled their curves to gain attention, some even making filthy promises to please the dark desires the emperor was known for. Izuku watched from the side with an appealing plate of soft pastries in hand and waited, as the coil in his gut grew tighter. He didn't know what he was waiting for. A glance, a signal, a sign of recognition, Majesty's attention. But even then came nothing, leaving the greenette empty in despair. He watched time eat at the long line in front of the throne, as Katsuki never looked over the crowd even once. That same crowd where he had been looking for the blonde for hours, as soon as he came in. Izuku turned, didn't even realize he was moving until the echo of the ballroom faded behind him, and the torchlight gave way to cool stone and silence. His breath came out sharp, almost panting. The corridor completely empty now that all the servants were stationed where they were needed, all the nobles gathered in gilded clusters. He leaned forward, suddenly running, his heart pounding in his chest, suddenly too aware of the collar around his neck and the way the uniform chafed when he moved. He didn't even look at me, Izuku thought. Why does that hurt more than it should? He suddenly found himself in the familiar blooming scent. The purple flowers who are used to crowding around him, now enveloping him as waves, as he ran through them in despair. Why was he running? What from? At the moment he just wanted to be as far away as possible. From where? Katsuki. His maid duties. Closer to the village. Closer to his mother. Before he could answer any of those questions, he stumbled over something harsh, making him thud to the ground. His small pale hands plunged in the soil, his new attire ruined, as he squealed in surprise. He lifted his head against a young growing lavender, before checking where he had fallen. The same flowers that had broken his fall were hiding something big and hard underneath. His eyes widened in confusion, as he stood eye to eye with a big expensive gravestone. Wide enough to be seen, but not tall enough to be seen beneath the bushes of roses. Was it hidden on purpose? Or cruelly forgotten, just like Izuku's existence? The stones of the southern training yard were always ice cold in the morning. They always bit at the flush thin skin around his ankles, but Katsuki learned not to flinch by the time he was 5. 2. He stood barefoot in the frostbitten dust, fists clenched, breathing hard, as the sun dragged itself up over the black spires of the outer palace. He spit 𝗫𝗫 against the cold sand, knowing there was more to come. His arms ached, veins seeming like they should pop. The 𝗫𝗫 from his nose reaching his lips, as one of the generals yelled at him across the field. He was weak, reflexes were 𝗧𝗵𝗲, and he could never cover his back. The blonde bit his lip hard enough to taste crimson, as his calloused fingertips gripped around the wooden training stick. His chest heaving for proper oxygen, as lungs filled with heavy sand. His father had never showed up even once since he was 6. The boy didn't know if it was out of disappointment, disdain, or anger, but he was grateful. If his father got to see how slow he was improving, he would come to beat Katsuki himself. Bruises marred the 14-year-old's skin, cuts on his arms, his back, his face. The stinging never ended and he never stopped bruising. They were symbols of his weakness, signaling his bad coordination and defense reflexes. But unlike the stinging and bruising, his tears had stopped. He hadn't cried even once in 2 years. Ever since his coming-of-age ceremony where he had failed in front of the whole empire, his tears had stopped forming. "Make it suffer," his father had said that day from the edge of the platform, arms folded across his wide, armored chest. "Or I'll make sure you will." Katsuki hadn't responded, but could still hear the words every punch, strike, and kick he received, echoing into his skull, or in dark nights where the silence reminded him of his meaningless existence. The guard suddenly came at him again, making Katsuki's grip on the spear tighten. He ducked, redirected, and avoided the first few blows, but already braced for the impact of the wooden stick against his ankles. Suddenly the wood harshly smacked against his back, creating a fresh deep bruise. He let out a pained groan, before thudding to the floor, exhausted and defeated, making the guard click his tongue with annoyance. "You fool!" the general screamed from the raised platform above the training field. "How many times have I told you to cover your back?" The rhetorical question unanswered by the panting blonde, who finally found the power to get back up. The general mumbled something under his breath, before signaling the training was over, waving the wounded boy off. Always his back. Useless boy. 3-5 The Imperial Hall was too big. So big that it echoed even when people whispered. Katsuki could often hear nobles' concern for the weak prince's progress or rumors about alliances to overthrow him and murder him. The prince walked stiffly past the high tables, trying not to limp from the fresh injuries still clawing up his nerves. He tried to avoid his father, after hearing a servant say the emperor was in the imperial suite of Congress. The blonde could only hope the important meeting with the other empires would take long. That way, he could maybe get some time to see his mother, the woman that hadn't spoken to him in more than 4 words for years. He finally found her, by asking some servants, as she was deeply hidden in the western gardens where roses grew without ceremony. It was obvious she didn't want to be found, since the servants had first refused to answer the boy's question. The woman was bent at the waist, gloved hands cupping a fallen bloom. Her long ash-blonde silver locks almost able to reach the ground, before she stood back up. Katsuki stopped at the edge of the path, frozen. His heart pounded in his chest. He carefully pulled his robe further over his bruises to hide them for his mother's fragile heart. She didn't notice him at first, as she tilted her head examining the petal, delicate and careful. As though the flower might bruise from looking too harshly. The young prince wanted to say something, but he wasn't sure what. Came out instead, a soft sound, addressing her like he did when he was younger, and used for years in front of others. She startled, her eyes immediately flickering to him, not cold, not cruel, just empty, but somehow still full of pity. Unprepared, she straightened quickly, smoothing the front of her gown like she'd been caught. "You shouldn't be here," she said in a cold, empty tone, as if the young boy had misread the pity earlier. "You should be with your tutors." She continued with the same numb expression, turning away from her desperate, lonely son. "Beeb, I finished," he answered, quiet and stuttering, exactly reflecting the things his father hated. His voice grew even more desperate and small, as if in reality he just wanted to plead. "They said I could dash. You shouldn't be here," she repeated, more firmly, as her fingers plucked at the edge of her sleeve. Her eyes darted toward the tall hedges that walled the garden from view, as if she nervously wanted to check whose eyes were watching. She disappeared behind tall bushes of yellow peony, before the boy could utter more words. Katsuki bit his lip, as if biting down tears that threatened to come up for the first time in years. Plus he held them down, as he reached the soft grass to look at the flower she dropped. It was a white, appealing rose that his mother had shown more care for than to the young prince's words. He swallowed the tightness in his throat as he watched the appealing flower wilt in his rough, wounded palm. Izuku hummed his usual lonely song as his finger trailed around his favorite orchids. The flowers reminding him of home again. Why couldn't he just go home? After all, it seemed the emperor no longer needed him. 3. He suddenly noticed the sky lighting up, the yellow light warming the pale skin of his freckled face. It was the dozens of luns for the fire festival. The sign of fortune in love for the emperor. Maybe this year Katsuki would succeed and find a bride. The thought of the blonde lighting a lantern with one of the appealing women that lined up earlier makes his chest tighten. The whole kingdom probably watched with glee as the emperor chooses his suitor by lighting the fire together. Lanterns swayed gently overhead, strung between the outer branches like slow-moving stars. Their soft glow turned the air golden. Shadows drifted between the hedges, the rustle of silk and soft laughter spilling from the banquet still echoing across the palace. Izuku knelt alone behind the tall foxglove stems, hidden in the corner furthest from the path. His fingers were curled around the edge of his sleeves as he watched the lanterns flicker above, his throat tightening with a strange ache. Izuku rubbed his eyes quickly, angrily. Stop it, he told himself. He hated how his chest tightened. He hated that he still looked for Katsuki's silhouette in the distance. Hated that he still waited to be noticed. Waiting to be noticed by the sole person who had caused him his eyes stung, making his vision hazy. The lantern lights blurring together to a miserable yellow mess. They'd soon just burn out and drop to their useless deaths. I'm not a lantern, Izuku suddenly mumbled bitterly, wiping his face on his sleeve. Don't just light me up when it's convenient. When the distant laughter and commotion disappeared behind the soft sniffles against the black fabric of Izuku's suit, the flowers around him suddenly darkened. Izuku flinched. It was someone's shadow. It was Katsuki, standing behind him, hands loose at his sides, a slight furrow between his brows. He still was in full ceremonial wear and panting softly, as if he had just ran away from the crowd. He looked so out of place against the soft gold hush of the garden. You always hide here, Katsuki said quietly, breaking the silence with a rough voice. His tone sounding more cold than accusing, but his scowl looking down at the other Izuku stiffened, but didn't answer, his parting lips just hovering over empty words. Izuku's small pale hands picked at a small flower, trying to ground himself. He hid his face away from the deeper voice, as he quickly wiped his wet cheeks. You always cry over the stupidest things, Katsuki said, with a dryness that almost sounded cruel, making Izuku realize that he'd already been found out. The cold words felt like a cold shiver through his chest, blooming with frozen misery through his veins. Izuku's breath hitched, before something inside him suddenly cracked open, as he finally dared to face the emperor. Udash! His voice shook, as he stood up with an almost angry expression. You don't get to say that. Katsuki blinked with surprise, his expression growing with melted anger, but mostly intrigue. Was his personal maid talking back to him? He knew he should have executed the boy when he got the chance. But Izuku continued, chest heaving, words tumbling before he could catch them. You don't know what it's like, he teared up again, his voice trembling, as salty drops tickled down his face. Vistache, he gestured wildly around the garden with his hands. Izuku was exhausted of all of this torture and that cold feeling coiling in his painful chest. He was clearly moving with more emotion than reason, as he raised his voice to the person who'd planned to kill him less than a week ago. This place, he brought out, staring up with his glassy hurt-appealing Jaden eyes at the taller man. You know this was hers, Izuku brought out with emotion deep in his voice. Every flower, every lantern, every tree reminding me of what I can't have. You walk past it like it's nothing, Izuku threw out in tears as Katsuki hesitated to take a step back. While I can only hurt by the distant memories of scented tulips and golden chrysanthemums that will never feel the same, Izuku looked back at the garden again, before sniffing his nose in a short silence. You might have the diamond, gold and silver to rebuild what my mother and I have been working on for years, he spat out towards the familiar flowers that had been haunting him with his mother's absence, but it'll never carry the same worth due to the rotten soil of this cruel empire. 2. Izuku halted after those words, feeling the emperor's wrath burn against his back, making him unable to turn around again. He gazed back at his feet with a smaller voice, his vision blurring more due to the tears pooling down. Izuku suddenly addressed the emperor formally again. "Why, you don't look at me, don't need me, don't talk to me and don't even curse my wrongs anymore," Izuku stuttered out, his voice angelic and soft, as if already begging for forgiveness. "Why taunt me cruelly with this familiar garden, if you can let me go back?" Why? Izuku's throat was raw now, only able to listen to the silence that Katsuki didn't seem to want to break. The boy could only watch the flowers sway with the wind in the cold night air, guessing what the man behind him was up to. He knew this conversation should end with the golden sword in his bony back, but he was too terrified to turn to face him. "I thought you liked it," too sounded silently after the long pause filled with the distant laughter and commotion. Katsuki waited hesitant about his next words, as he watched the lanterns flowing higher up the dark night. Izuku almost turned around, wondering if the other had disappeared, when Katsuki finally broke the second long silence. "Plus, my mother never gardened," he revealed in a softer voice, as if he wasn't sure the words should be heard. He paused between his words, clearly recollecting certain memories. She didn't quite leave things behind like that. Before Izuku could ask a question about the man's absence of anger, he heard the emperor's footsteps growing in distance. Izuku turned around, watching the man search for his words before continuing his steps. "Not taunting, it's," Katsuki's sentence trailed off with the lanterns. "So indeed, you might not have been mistaken. I don't know what it's like."